The lantern flickered against the approaching darkness, casting long shadows across the weathered floorboards of Ethan Blackwood's ranch house. Outside, the Arizona wind howled through cracks in the wooden walls, a mournful sound that matched the emptiness within. Ethan sat hunched at his desk, calloused fingers gripping a pencil, as he scratched words into a leather-bound journal. Rebecca, today marks 5 years. The ranch is falling apart just like everything else. Perhaps that's fitting. He paused, staring at the words as if they might somehow reach across the divide between the living and the dead. 5 years since the failed raid on the vultures. 5 years since he'd held his wife's body, her blood soaking into the dusty ground of that god-forsaken canyon. 5 years of nothing but ghosts and regrets. Ethan closed the journal with a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. At 45, the former federal marshal looked a decade older. His once sharp features now hidden beneath a graying beard, his eyes sunken and haunted. The badge he'd once worn with pride lay in a box beneath his bed, tarnished and forgotten, just like the man he used to be. Rising from the desk, he moved to the window, parting the threadbare curtains to gaze out at the desolate landscape. His ranch sprawled across 50 acres of harsh Arizona territory, most of it untended now. The barn needed repairs, the fences were falling, and the cattle had dwindled to a pitiful few. In the corner of the property visible from his window, Rebecca's garden lay in ruins, once vibrant flowers, now replaced by weeds and dust. "Should have planted those roses like you wanted," he murmured to the empty room. Sleep would not come easily tonight. It never did on the anniversary. Ethan reached for the bottle of whiskey on the sideboard, pouring 2 fingers into a glass that hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks. The amber liquid burned his throat, a welcome distraction from the memories that pressed in from all sides. The dreams always came on nights like this, vivid and merciless. Rebecca standing before him, her blue dress stained crimson, her eyes filled with accusation. "You saw the signs, Ethan. You saw them and did nothing." Always the same words, cutting deeper than any knife. Ethan drained his glass and poured another, hoping to dull the edges of his consciousness enough to find a few hours of dreamless oblivion. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters like impatient fingers. Something about the sound made him pause. His instincts dulled, but not dead, suddenly alert. Setting down his glass, he moved silently to the gun cabinet, retrieving his Winchester rifle. Old habits from his martial days surfaced as he checked the chamber, finding it loaded. He hadn't survived 20 years of law enforcement by ignoring his instincts. The previous day, he'd found footprints near the western fence, too large to be his own, too fresh to be old. This morning, his coffee pot had been moved from its usual place on the stove to the counter. Small things, perhaps insignificant, but to a man trained to notice details, they screamed of intrusion. Someone was watching his ranch. Ethan positioned himself by the window, rifle at the ready, eyes scanning the darkness beyond. The moon slipped behind clouds, plunging the landscape into deeper shadow. Minutes stretched into hours as he maintained his vigil, the old discipline returning like a language once fluently spoken. When dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky in hues of crimson and gold, Ethan's eyes burned with fatigue. No intruders had revealed themselves, but the sense of impending danger had not diminished. He placed the rifle against the wall and moved to the kitchen, mechanically preparing coffee on the wood stove. As the bitter brew boiled, he stepped outside onto the porch, surveying his neglected kingdom. The morning light revealed the extent of his neglect, peeling paint, rotting wood, a once proud ranch slowly surrendering to entropy, just like its owner. Ethan's gaze drifted to the small cross marking Rebecca's grave beneath the old oak tree. They'd been happy here once. For 2 brief years between his time as a marshal and the tragedy, they'd built something that almost resembled peace. Rebecca had planted her garden, talked of children, painted the kitchen a cheery yellow that now peeled in sad, faded strips. The coffee boiled over, hissing as it hit the hot stove. Ethan cursed, hurrying back inside to salvage what he could. As he cleaned up the mess, his eyes caught on something through the kitchen window, a flicker of movement by the barn there, and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. But Ethan Blackwood didn't imagine things. Retrieving his rifle once more, he slipped out the back door, moving with a stealth that belied his years of inactivity. The gravel crunched softly beneath his boots as he approached the barn, keeping to the shadows, body tensed for confrontation. The barn door stood slightly ajar. He always kept it latched. Heart pounding, Ethan pressed his back against the sun-bleached wood, listening. silence save for the nervous shuffling of his remaining horses. Taking a deep breath, he swung around, rifle raised, and entered in one fluid motion. Nothing. No intruder, no obvious signs of disturbance. The horses watched him with dark, liquid eyes, unimpressed by his dramatic entrance. Ethan lowered his rifle slightly, scanning the shadowy interior. Hay bales, tack, old tools, everything seemed in its proper place. Then he saw it, a footprint in the dust near the back wall, too small for his own boot. Someone had been here and recently. Moving closer, he examined the print, a man's boot, well worn at the heel, suggesting someone who spent much time on horseback. As Ethan straightened, a glint of metal caught his eye. Tucked between two hay bales was a brass spur not his own. He picked it up, turning it over in his palm. It was expensively made, engraved with an intricate pattern he recognized all too well, a vulture with outstretched wings. Ice flooded his veins. The vultures. After 5 years, they had found him. The question was, why now? Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as the day wore on, promising a storm by nightfall. Ethan spent the hours fortifying his position, checking ammunition, barricading windows, preparing for a fight he knew was coming. The spur lay on his kitchen table, a tangible reminder of the past he could never truly escape. The vultures were more than just an outlaw gang. They were a cancer that had infested the Arizona territory for over a decade. Led by the ruthless James Vulture Hayes, they controlled gambling protection rackets, and worse, across 3 counties. 5 years ago, Ethan had led a team of marshals in a raid on their main hideout in Rattlesnake Canyon, acting on intelligence that suggested Hayes himself would be present. It had been a trap. Of the 12 men who rode into that canyon, only 4 rode out. And Rebecca, dear God, Rebecca, who had been at the nearby town's medical clinic, was caught in the crossfire when Vulture's men raided the town in retaliation. Ethan had arrived too late, finding her body among the clinic's ruins. Something inside him had died that day, buried alongside his wife beneath the oak tree. He'd resigned his badge the following week and retreated to the ranch, a ghost haunting the remains of his former life. Now, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Ethan cleaned his Colt revolver with methodical precision, his mind clearer than it had been in years. If the vultures had found him, if they were coming to finish what they started 5 years ago, he would not go quietly. Perhaps there was a certain poetry to it, an end to his half-life, a reunion with Rebecca in whatever lay beyond. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as dusk descended, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. Ethan positioned himself in the darkened living room, rifle across his lap, Colt at his side. Lightning flashed briefly, illuminating the yard outside before plunging it back into darkness. In that momentary flash, he saw them 2 riders approaching from the east, moving with purpose through the downpour. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady. This at least was familiar, the calm before violence, the crystalline clarity of impending confrontation. For the first time in 5 years, he felt fully present, fully alive. Another lightning flash. The riders were closer now, perhaps 50 yards from the house. One of them gestured toward the barn, while the other nodded in response. They were splitting up, one to the barn, one to the house. A standard flanking maneuver. Ethan moved silently to the kitchen, where he had a better view of the approach to the barn. Rain lashed against the windows, making it difficult to see clearly, but he caught glimpses of the first rider dismounting, tying his horse to a post before slipping inside the barn. The second rider approached the house directly, seemingly unconcerned about concealment. Confidence or arrogance, either way, it would be his downfall. A heavy knock rattled the front door. "Blackwood," a voice called, barely audible above the storm. "We know you're in there. Open up." Ethan remained silent, adjusting his grip on the rifle. "Last chance, Marshal. We ain't here to kill you, just to talk." The laugh that escaped Ethan's lips was harsh and humorless. 5 years of silence, and now they wanted to talk. The vultures didn't talk. They killed, they destroyed, they took everything that mattered. The front window exploded inward in a shower of glass as a shot rang out. Ethan dropped to the floor as splinters flew from the wall behind where he'd been standing. Amateur move, firing blind into a darkened house. "Guess we're done talking," Ethan muttered, crawling toward the kitchen. Another shot, another window shattered. Ethan used the noise as cover to position himself behind the heavy oak table he had overturned earlier. From here, he had a clear line of sight to both the front door and the kitchen entrance. The front door burst open, kicked in with enough force to splinter the frame. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, backlit by another flash of lightning. Ethan didn't hesitate. His rifle cracked once the sound deafening in the confined space. The figure staggered backward, clutching his shoulder before diving to the side and returning fire. Bullets thudded into the table as Ethan pressed himself lower. He ejected the spent cartridge, chambered another round. "You're dead, Blackwood," the wounded man shouted, his voice tight with pain. "You and that whore wife of yours should have stayed out of our business." White-hot rage surged through Ethan's veins at the mention of Rebecca. Rising slightly, he fired again, then again. The third shot found its mark. The intruder collapsed in the doorway, his revolver clattering to the floor. Silence fell, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Ethan remained crouched behind the table, listening intently. The second rider was still unaccounted for. As if on cue, a floorboard creaked behind him, the back entrance through the kitchen. Ethan spun, raising his rifle, but too slow. A massive weight crashed into him, sending both men sprawling across the floor, the rifle skittering away into the darkness. His attacker was younger, stronger, with the advantage of momentum. A fist connected with Ethan's jaw, snapping his head back. Stars exploded across his vision as he fought to maintain consciousness. Another blow, this one to his ribs, driving the air from his lungs. Instinct and training took over. Ethan brought his knee up sharply, connecting with his attacker's groin. The man grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for Ethan to break free and scramble for his fallen Colt. His fingers had just closed around the revolver's grip when a boot stomped down on his wrist. Bones ground together as Ethan bit back a scream. Looking up, he found himself staring into the barrel of a pistol. "End of the trail, Marshal," the man sneered, his face illuminated by another lightning flash. He was young, perhaps 30, with a face marred by a jagged scar that ran from temple to chin. His duster was soaked with rain, and beneath it, Ethan caught a glimpse of something on his wrist, a tattoo of a vulture in flight. "Been waiting 5 years for this," the scarred man continued, thumbing back the hammer of his pistol. "Boss wants your head as a trophy." Ethan's free hand inched toward the knife in his boot. "Your boss should have come himself if he wanted it so badly." The man laughed. "Hayes don't dirty his hands with trash like you anymore. Not since he got himself respectable." He pressed the barrel of the pistol against Ethan's forehead. "Any last words for your pretty wife?" The knife cleared Ethan's boot in one smooth motion, arcing upward into the scarred man's thigh. Blood spurted as the blade found the femoral artery, a fatal wound if not treated immediately. The man screamed, his shot going wild as he staggered backward, clutching at his leg. Ethan wasted no time. Freeing his pinned hand, he grabbed his Colt and fired once, twice. The scarred man collapsed, his blood mingling with rainwater on the wooden floor. For long moments, Ethan lay where he had fallen, chest heaving, every muscle screaming in protest. The storm raged on outside, indifferent to the violence it had witnessed. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet, surveying the carnage. 2 dead men in his home blood soaking into the floorboards. He should feel something: regret, satisfaction, anything. Instead, there was only a hollow emptiness, the same void that had consumed him for 5 years. Moving to the first intruder's body, Ethan searched the man's pockets, finding nothing but a few coins and a folded piece of paper. Opening it, he frowned at the official-looking document that emerged: a warrant for his arrest signed by Judge Sullivan of Tucson. The charges listed were absurd: theft, assault, murder. Crimes he had never committed. But there it was in black and white, the seal of the territorial court, making it official. "What the hell?" Ethan muttered, turning the paper over. On the back was a crude map showing the location of his ranch, along with a single line of text: "Leave no witnesses." This was no random attack, no simple revenge killing. This was an execution sanctioned by a territorial judge. But why? What could possibly connect Judge Sullivan to the vultures? Lightning flashed again, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The storm was directly overhead now, rain pounding against the roof with such force it threatened to break through. In that moment, sitting in his blood-spattered home with 2 dead men for company, Ethan Blackwood made a decision. He would not wait for more killers to come. It was time to stop running from the past, time to face whatever conspiracy had targeted him. Time to find the truth about Rebecca's death. For the first time in 5 years, Ethan felt something stir within the empty cavern of his chest, a spark, a purpose. Not hope, not yet, but something close to it, something worth living for. Outside, the storm continued to rage as if heaven itself wept for what was to come. Dawn broke over the ranch, revealing a landscape transformed by the night's storm. Fallen branches littered the yard, and a section of the barn roof had collapsed, exposing the interior to the elements. The rain had washed away the blood from the porch, but nothing could cleanse the memory of violence from Ethan's mind. He had spent the remainder of the night disposing of the bodies, burying them in unmarked graves far from the house. The surviving intruder, the one he'd managed to capture alive, was secured in the root cellar, bound and unconscious, but stable. Questions would come later. Now, as the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky, Ethan stood in the center of Rebecca's ruined garden, the damp earth seeping into his boots. In his hand, he clutched the warrant he'd found, the paper crumpled and stained with blood at the edges. Judge Sullivan. The name was vaguely familiar, a recent appointment to the territorial bench known for his harsh sentences and unwavering support for railroad interests. What possible reason could such a man have for wanting Ethan Blackwood dead? A movement caught his eye, a lone rider approaching from the south, following the creek that marked the boundary of his property. Instinctively, Ethan's hand moved to the Colt at his hip, but something about the rider's posture gave him pause. They were slumped forward, barely maintaining their seat, the horse moving at an unhurried walk. Whoever it was, they posed no immediate threat. Ethan watched as the rider drew closer, eventually recognizing the slight form of a woman. Her clothes were torn and muddied, her dark hair falling in tangled waves around a face too pale for the Arizona sun. As her horse reached the edge of the yard, she looked up, meeting Ethan's gaze with eyes that held equal parts fear and determination. "Help," she managed, her voice barely audible. Then she pitched sideways, sliding from her saddle to land in a crumpled heap on the wet ground. Ethan reached her in moments, kneeling beside her fallen form. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 30, with delicate features marred by a livid bruise across her right cheek. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and when he gently probed for injuries, he found her right arm bent at an unnatural angle, broken and recently. "Ma'am," he said lightly, tapping her uninjured cheek. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes of a startling emerald green. "They're coming," she whispered, clutching at his shirt with her good hand. "Please, hide me." "Who's coming?" Ethan asked, already scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. "Vultures," she breathed before slipping back into unconsciousness. That single word was enough. Ethan gathered the woman into his arms, surprised by how little she weighed, and carried her swiftly toward the house. Inside, he placed her on the sofa, then moved to the windows, drawing the curtains and checking that his weapons were within easy reach. The woman's horse still stood in the yard, head drooping with exhaustion. Ethan hesitated, then decided to bring it into the barn. Leaving it outside would be like posting a sign announcing her presence. As he led the tired animal away, he noticed something hanging from the saddle, a leather satchel, its contents seemingly untouched. Curiosity warred with respect for privacy, but given the circumstances, caution won out. Ethan detached the satchel and carried it back to the house where the woman remained unconscious. Setting it aside for the moment, he turned his attention to her injuries. The break in her arm was clean at least. Ethan had set enough bones during his time as a marshal to know what needed to be done. Working quickly but gently, he gathered the necessary supplies: splints, bandages, a bottle of whiskey for disinfection, and another for pain. By the time he had everything prepared, his unexpected guest was beginning to stir. "Easy now," he said as her eyes opened once more. "You're safe for the moment, but that arm needs tending." She blinked, confusion evident in her expression as she took in her surroundings. "Where am I?" "My ranch about 20 miles east of Promise Creek," Ethan replied, pouring a measure of whiskey into a glass. "Drink this. What I'm about to do will hurt." To her credit, she didn't argue, accepting the glass with her uninjured hand and downing the contents in one swallow. Only a slight grimace betrayed her discomfort with the strong liquor. "My name is Sophia," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "Sophia Harmon." "Ethan Blackwood," he replied, beginning to examine her injured arm more thoroughly. "What brought you to my door, Miss Harmon? And who exactly is hunting you?" Sophia's laugh was hollow, ending in a wince as he gently probed the break. "It's a long story, Mr. Blackwood, one I'm not sure you want to hear." "Try me," Ethan said, positioning her arm for setting. "This will hurt." "Ready." She nodded, bracing herself. With one swift, practiced motion, Ethan realigned the broken bone. Sophia's entire body went rigid, a strangled cry escaping her lips before she clamped them shut, refusing to give voice to her pain. Impressive, Ethan commented, reaching for the splints. Most men would have passed out. Not my first broken bone, she replied through gritted teeth. As Ethan worked to secure the splints and wrap her arm, Sophia studied him with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every detail of his face. It was unsettling, that scrutiny, as if she already knew more about him than she should. You were a lawman, she said finally. It wasn't a question. Ethan's hands stilled momentarily before continuing their work. Once, federal marshal. How did you know? The way you move, the way you handled my injury, and the look in your eyes like you've seen the worst humanity has to offer and somehow survived it. Her assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Ethan finished bandaging her arm in silence, securing the wrapping with a small knot. There. Not as good as a doctor would do, but it should hold until we can get you to one. Thank you, Sophia said, testing the bandage with a cautious movement. Though I'm afraid a doctor is out of the question for now. The men following me, they have connections everywhere. The vultures, Ethan said, his voice hardening at the name. What's your connection to the... Sophia hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. I'm a reporter for the Arizona Herald. I've been investigating land seizures along the proposed railroad route properties foreclosed upon under suspicious circumstances, homesteaders driven off by intimidation, or worse. She looked up, meeting his eyes once more. All the threads led back to Judge Sullivan and a group of investors calling themselves the Arizona Central Development Company. When I started asking questions about the company's backers, that's when the vultures came into the picture. Ethan's mind raced, connecting the pieces. The warrant in his pocket, signed by Sullivan. The attack on his ranch. And now this woman hunted by the same people for asking dangerous questions. What exactly did you find? He asked, retrieving the satchel from where he'd placed it. Sophia's eyes widened at the sight. My research. You took it from my horse. Considering the circumstances, I thought it prudent, Ethan replied, not apologizing. Is this what they're after? Part of it, she admitted. Documents proving Sullivan's connection to the development company, land deeds transferred under dubious circumstances, testimonies from people who were threatened. She reached for the satchel with her good hand. But there's more. Something personal. Ethan hesitated, then handed over the bag. Trust was a luxury neither of them could afford, but instinct told him she wasn't lying about this, at least. Sophia rummaged through the contents, one-handed, eventually withdrawing a yellowed envelope. This is why I came looking for you, specifically, Mr. Blackwood. Me, Ethan frowned. I don't understand. Instead of explaining, Sophia carefully opened the envelope and removed a photograph, handing it to him with solemn reverence. Do you recognize her? Ethan's heart stuttered in his chest as he stared at the image. Two women in nurses' uniforms stood side by side outside a small medical clinic, arms linked, smiling at the camera. One of them was Rebecca, younger than when he'd known her, her hair longer, but unmistakably his wife. The other woman, though superficially similar in coloring, was a stranger to him. Her features were sharper, her stance more confident, her smile holding a hint of something Rebecca's never had, a certain hardness, a knowledge of the world's darker aspects. The woman on the left is Rebecca, he said, his voice rough with emotion. My wife. She's been dead 5 years now. The other woman, I don't know her. That's Diana, Sophia said softly. Diana Harmon, my sister. She worked with Rebecca at the Prescott Clinic before it was relocated to Promise Creek. She disappeared 5 years ago, shortly before the raid on the Vulture's hideout. Ethan's head snapped up, his gaze boring into hers. What are you saying? I'm saying our losses are connected, Mr. Blackwood. My sister and your wife were friends. They were both investigating strange cases at the clinic, women brought in with suspicious injuries, official records that didn't match the actual patients. They suspected the clinic was being used as a cover for something darker. Sophia leaned forward, her expression intense. The last letter I received from Diana mentioned Rebecca by name. She said they were gathering evidence against someone powerful, someone connected to both the territorial government and the vultures. Ethan stared at the photograph, at Rebecca's smiling face, so full of life and purpose. Had she been investigating something dangerous without telling him? It seemed impossible, yet. You saw the signs, Ethan. You saw them and did nothing. The words from his recurring nightmare suddenly took on new meaning. Had there been signs? Had Rebecca tried to tell him something, and he'd been too preoccupied with his own work to notice? I need to show you something else. Sophia said, breaking into his thoughts. She withdrew a small journal from the satchel. This was Diana's. Most of it is in a code we developed as children, but I've managed to translate parts of it. There are entries about Rebecca about their investigation. She opened the journal to a marked page pointing to a specific passage. Here dated just 2 weeks before she disappeared. R thinks she found a connection to the judge. Records of payments names that match with missing women. Too dangerous to go to the marshals, yet need more proof. R's husband might help, but she wants to protect him. Ethan took the journal with trembling hands, staring at the unfamiliar handwriting, as if it might somehow transform into Rebecca's. She never said anything to me, never even hinted at being involved in something like this. She was protecting you, Sophia said gently, just as Diana tried to protect me by keeping me in the dark. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan, two women trying to shield the people they loved only to leave them adrift in the aftermath of tragedy. Had Rebecca known the danger she was in? Had she faced her death alone, carrying secrets she'd kept even from him? There's something else, Sophia continued, her voice hesitant. Something that's been bothering me since I arrived. We've met before, Mr. Blackwood, though I doubt you remember it. Ethan frowned, studying her face more carefully. There was something vaguely familiar about her features now that she mentioned it, but he couldn't place the memory. It was at a funeral, she prompted, for a woman named Mary Callahan. She was a witness in a case you were investigating, a brothel fire in Tucson, if I recall correctly. The memory surfaced slowly, fragmentary at first, then with increasing clarity. Mary Callahan, a prostitute who'd agreed to testify against the brothel's owner, found dead in her room the day before the trial. Her funeral had been sparsely attended. Ethan, a few other women from the brothel, and you were there, he said, recognition dawning. In the back row, you wore a black veil, but I remember thinking you didn't look like one of the working girls. Sophia nodded. I was covering the story for the Herald. Mary had agreed to speak with me about her testimony. She had information about clients' powerful men who frequented the establishment. Information that never made it into the official investigation. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Judge Sullivan? Ethan guessed. He was one of the clients. Yes, Sophia confirmed, but there was more to it than just patronizing a brothel. Mary claimed some of the women there weren't working voluntarily. They'd been brought in from elsewhere, kept compliant through threats or laudanum. When they became too troublesome or visible, they'd suddenly develop injuries requiring medical attention. At the clinic where Rebecca and Diana worked, Ethan finished, the horrible truth beginning to unfold before him. Sophia's expression was grim. Exactly. I believe your wife and my sister stumbled onto a trafficking operation, one protected by Sullivan and carried out by the vultures. When they got too close to the truth, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Ethan knew all too well what happened to people who crossed paths with the vultures. The raid that had supposedly been targeting their criminal operations, had it been a deliberate setup, a way to eliminate Rebecca and Diana while making it look like collateral damage in a larger operation, the thought made him physically ill. Rising abruptly, Ethan moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to scan the horizon. The land remained quiet, no sign of approaching riders, but that didn't mean they weren't coming. If Sophia had been followed to his ranch, we need to move, he said, his decision made. It's not safe here. They'll send more men when the first two don't return. Two, Sophia questioned, alarmed. Attacked last night during the storm, Ethan explained briefly. One's dead, the other's secured in my cellar. He might have information we can use. Sophia's expression showed both surprise and a certain respect at this revelation. Where can we go if Sullivan is involved? Nowhere in the territory is truly safe. Phoenix, Ethan decided. Judge Holloway presides there. He's known for his integrity, and he was a friend to my former superior. If your evidence is as compelling as you suggest, he might be willing to act on it. It's a 3-day ride under good conditions, Sophia pointed out. With my injury and men hunting us, 4 days, maybe 5, Ethan acknowledged. But we have no choice. Whatever this conspiracy is, it's bigger than just you and me. If Sullivan and the vultures are working together to traffic women using the railroad development as cover, he didn't need to elaborate. Such a scheme would represent corruption at the highest levels, affecting countless lives across the territory. The kind of cancer that, left unchecked, would destroy everything in its path. There's one more thing you should see, Sophia said, reaching into her satchel one final time. She withdrew a folded newspaper clipping, handing it to Ethan with a solemnity that made his stomach clench. The headline read, "Judge Sullivan to preside over Land Commission hearing." The date at the top of the clipping was just 6 days away. "The final approval for the railroad route," Sophia explained. "Once it passes, all the seized land becomes officially designated for railroad use. The original owners lose any right to contest the takings even if they were fraudulent." Ethan understood the implications immediately. "They're cleaning house, eliminating anyone who might interfere before the hearing. That's why they came after me now. After 5 years, they're tying up loose ends." "Yes," Sophia agreed, "which means we have less than a week to get to Phoenix and present our evidence to Judge Holloway. After that, it's too late," Ethan finished grimly. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun, casting the room into momentary shadow. Ethan felt the weight of the past 5 years, the grief, the isolation, the slow surrender to despair begin to lift, replaced by something harder and more focused. A purpose, a mission. "I'll question our guest," he said, moving toward the door to the cellar. "Then we'll gather supplies and leave before nightfall. The old Apache trail through the mountains might be our best route, less traveled, harder to follow." Sophia nodded, attempting to stand. Her legs wobbled beneath her, betraying her exhaustion and the trauma her body had endured. Ethan moved quickly to her side, supporting her with a strong arm. "Rest," he advised. "You'll need your strength for the journey ahead." For a moment they stood close enough that he could feel the warmth of her breath against his cheek, could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. Something passed between them. Not an attraction, not yet, but a recognition. Two souls connected by loss, by a shared determination to uncover the truth no matter the cost. "Thank you," Sophia said softly, "for believing me, for helping." Ethan nodded once, then gently helped her back to the sofa. "Try to sleep. I'll wake you when it's time to leave." As he descended into the cellar to confront their prisoner, Ethan felt a strange sense of awakening, as if he'd been sleepwalking through the past 5 years and had finally painfully returned to consciousness. The man who emerged from that cellar an hour later was changed, harder, colder, but also more alive than he had been in years. The storm had passed, but another was gathering on the horizon. This time, Ethan Blackwood would not be caught unprepared. Dusk painted the Arizona landscape in hues of amber and violet as Ethan secured the last of their supplies onto the pack horses. They traveled light food, water, ammunition, and Sophia's precious satchel of evidence. Everything else was expendable. The prisoner in the cellar had yielded little useful information before succumbing to his injuries, just confirmation that Judge Sullivan had personally ordered Ethan's elimination and that the vultures were indeed working for the Arizona Central Development Company. Ethan had buried the man alongside his companions, marking another death on his conscience, another reason to see this through to the end. Sophia emerged from the house, her broken arms secured in a sling fashioned from one of Rebecca's old shawls. She had regained some color in her cheeks after a few hours of rest, though the bruise on her face had darkened to a deep purple. Despite her injuries, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that Ethan couldn't help but admire. "Ready?" he asked, helping her mount a gentle mare he'd selected for her. With her injury, controlling a more spirited horse would be challenging. Sophia nodded, settling into the saddle with practiced ease. "As I'll ever be." Ethan mounted his own horse, a sturdy Mustang that had been with him since his marshal days. As they turned toward the trail that would lead them into the mountains, he cast one final glance at the ranch house, the place that had been both sanctuary and prison for 5 long years. Would he ever see it again? Did he even want to? The questions lingered unanswered as they rode away, two figures silhouetted against the dying light. The old Apache trail wound through the foothills like a serpent, narrow and treacherous in places, offering concealment at the cost of speed. They rode in silence for the first few hours, each lost in private thoughts, the rhythm of hoofbeats on packed earth marking the passage of time. Nightfall brought cooler temperatures and the soft hooting of owls from the pine trees that now surrounded them. When they reached a small clearing beside a stream, Ethan called a halt. They would rest here for a few hours before continuing by moonlight. "No fire," he instructed as he helped Sophia dismount. "Can't risk the smoke being spotted." She didn't protest, though the night air carried a chill that seeped through clothing and into bone. Instead, she helped unpack their meager provisions one-handed, arranging a simple meal of jerky, dried fruit, and water. As they ate sitting on fallen logs near the stream, Ethan found himself studying her profile in the dim starlight. There was a resilience to her that reminded him of Rebecca, Yet the similarities ended there. Where Rebecca had been sunshine and healing, Sophia was shadow and justice, harder, more determined, shaped by different fires. Tell me about her, Sophia said, suddenly breaking the silence. Rebecca, Diana wrote that she was kind, that she cared deeply about her patients. Ethan's throat tightened at the unexpected request. When was the last time he'd spoken of Rebecca to another person? Had he ever really talked about who she was, rather than simply mourning her loss? He confirmed, his voice rough with disuse, kind to a fault sometimes. She'd bring home strays, cats, dogs, once even a wounded hawk. Said she couldn't bear to see anything suffering if she could help it. The memory surfaced, unbidden, Rebecca on their porch cradling the injured raptor, its fierce eyes watching her with a mixture of fear and something almost like trust. She'd never turn anyone away who needed help. It's what made her a good nurse. And a good wife, Sophia prompted gently. The best, Ethan said, surprising himself with the emotion that welled up beneath the simple words. Better than I deserve, certainly. She saw something in me worth saving, even when I couldn't see it myself. He fell silent, memories washing over him, like the stream flowing past their campsite. Rebecca laughing in their kitchen, Rebecca planting her garden with meticulous care, Rebecca's face in those final moments pale and still against the bloodied ground. I dream about her, he admitted, the words emerging without conscious thought. Not pleasant dreams. In them she's accusing me, saying I saw signs and did nothing, that I failed her. Sophia's gaze was steady, unflinching. Do you think you did fail her? The question hung in the air between them, demanding honesty. Ethan wasn't sure he possessed. Had he failed Rebecca? By not noticing her involvement in something dangerous, by not being there when the vultures attacked the clinic, by retreating into himself afterward, abandoning the pursuit of justice that had once defined him. Yes, he said finally, the admission like a stone lifted from his chest. In more ways than I can count. Sophia nodded, not in judgment, but in understanding. I feel the same about Diana. I should have known something was wrong when her letters became less frequent. Should have investigated sooner, pushed harder for answers. She looked down at her hands, one whole, one bandaged and broken. Instead, I convinced myself she was just busy with her work, maybe even avoiding me because of an argument we'd had before she left for Prescott. By the time I realized something was truly wrong, it was too late, Ethan finished for her. Their eyes met across the small space between them, a current of shared grief creating a connection deeper than words could express. In that moment, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years, the simple relief of being understood. The moment passed as Sophia reached for her satchel, withdrawing Diana's journal once more. There's something else you should see, she said, turning to a specific page. An entry I only managed to decipher recently. She handed him the journal, pointing to a passage written in what appeared to be a personal code, with Sophia's translation written beneath in pencil. April 3rd, 1880. R found financial records in the clinic's basement. Payments from Sullivan's office to Dr. Wells for special consultations. Dates match with the disappearances. She's keeping the evidence at home, hidden in that hollow book she loves, the one about birds. Says it's safer there than at the clinic. We're meeting tomorrow to compare notes before taking everything to the marshals. Ethan stared at the words, a cold realization dawning. April 3rd, Rebecca died on April 4th, the day after this entry. Yes, Sophia confirmed softly, and Diana disappeared the same day. The hollow book, Ethan murmured, memory stirring. Rebecca had a collection of nature books. One about birds of the Southwest. She kept it on her bedside table. After she died, I packed away her things. The books are still in a trunk in our bedroom. The implications were staggering. All this time, evidence that might have explained Rebecca's death, that might have brought her killers to justice, had been sitting in his home undisturbed and undiscovered. We have to go back, he said, rising to his feet. The evidence Diana mentioned, it could be crucial. Sophia shook her head firmly. We can't. The ranch isn't safe. If Sullivan's men found you once, they'll come again in greater numbers. Our best chance is to continue to Phoenix with what we have. Logic told Ethan she was right, but the thought of abandoning what might be Rebecca's final legacy, the truth she'd died trying to expose, was unbearable. We need that evidence, he insisted. What we have may not be enough to convince Judge Holloway, especially against someone as powerful as Sullivan. Sophia considered this, her expression troubled. Perhaps there's another way, she said finally. A compromise. We continue toward Phoenix, but we take a route that passes near Promise Creek. The old clinic where Rebecca and Diana worked, it might still contain records, something to corroborate what we already have. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. Ethan nodded reluctantly. Promise Creek is a 2-day detour from our current route. If we push hard, we might still reach Phoenix before the Land Commission hearing. Then it's settled, Sophia said, rising as well. She swayed slightly, the day's exertions taking their toll on her injured body. Ethan moved instinctively to steady her, his hand catching her uninjured arm. The contact was brief, practical, yet somehow intimate in the quiet darkness of the forest. For a heartbeat, they stood close enough to feel the warmth of each other's breath, a moment suspended between what was and what might be. Then Sophia stepped back, breaking the connection. We should rest, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil Ethan glimpsed in her eyes. Tomorrow will be challenging. As they settled into their bedrolls beneath the stars, Ethan found his thoughts turning not to the dangers ahead or the mysteries of the past, but to the woman lying a few feet away. Sophia Harmon was an enigma, part investigative reporter, part avenging angel pursuing justice for her sister, with a determination that matched his own dormant sense of purpose. In another life, under different circumstances, he might have. Ethan pushed the thought away. Such considerations were luxuries neither of them could afford. What mattered now was survival, justice, truth. Everything else was secondary. Sleep claimed him eventually, but his dreams were troubled fragments of memory and nightmare intertwining. Rebecca's accusing face transformed into Diana's, then Sophia's. Blood on clinic floors, the vultures circling overhead. And through it all, a single name repeated like a prayer or a curse: Logan. He woke with a start, the name still echoing in his mind, though he couldn't place its significance. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, the stars fading as dawn approached. Beside him, Sophia slept fitfully, her brow furrowed, even in repose. As quietly as possible, Ethan rose and moved to check on the horses, his instincts alerting him to a change in the forest's rhythm. Something was different. The birds had fallen silent, and the air held a tension that raised the hair on the back of his neck. They were being watched. Slowly, casually, Ethan adjusted his gun belt, ensuring the Colt was loose in its holster. His rifle was still secured to his saddle, too far to reach without alerting whoever lurked in the shadows. Instead, he continued his inspection of the horses, all while scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. There, a flash of metal among the pines, quickly concealed but unmistakable. Someone with a rifle or spyglass observing their camp from approximately 50 yards to the north. Just one watcher, or several, impossible to tell, without revealing that he'd spotted them. Ethan returned to where Sophia slept, kneeling beside her and gently covering her mouth with his hand to prevent any startled exclamation. Her eyes flew open instantly, hand moving to the knife at her belt before recognition dawned. Ethan put a finger to his lips, then leaned close to whisper in her ear. We have company, north side of the clearing. When I give the signal, move to the horses as quickly and quietly as you can. Sophia nodded, her body tensing as she prepared for action. Ethan removed his hand from her mouth, impressed by her control. No panic, no questions, just immediate understanding of the situation. Rising smoothly, he stretched as if just waking, using the motion to scan the tree line once more. The watcher remained hidden, but Ethan could feel their presence, a prickling awareness between his shoulder blades. Now, he murmured, reaching for his saddlebags with deliberate casualness. Sophia was on her feet in an instant, moving toward the horses with a grace that belied her injury. Ethan followed, positioning himself between her and the unseen observer, his body a shield against potential gunfire. They had almost reached the horses when a voice called out from the trees, stopping them in their tracks. That's far enough, Blackwood. Ethan's hand hovered over his Colt as a figure emerged from the pine's, rifle lowered but ready. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with the weathered face of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. A badge glinted on his vest, Deputy Marshal. But it was his identity, not his occupation, that caused Ethan's breath to catch. Reynolds, he said, a complex mixture of emotions coloring the name. Thomas Reynolds. The newcomer's mouth curved in a grim approximation of a smile. Been a long time, Ethan. 5 years, give or take. Thomas Reynolds had been more than just a fellow marshal. He had been Ethan's closest friend, his partner on countless missions, the man who had stood beside him at his wedding to Rebecca. He had also been one of the few survivors of the raid on the Vulture's hideout, the last person Ethan had spoken to before finding Rebecca's body and withdrawing from the world. "What are you doing here, Thomas?" Ethan asked, not relaxing his guard despite their history. Reynolds slung his rifle over his shoulder, a gesture of peace that did little to ease the tension crackling between them. "Heard there was trouble at your ranch. 2 dead men, a missing prisoner. Thought I should check on an old friend." His gaze shifted to Sophia, assessing her with the practiced eye of a lawman. "Didn't expect to find you with company, though, especially such interesting company." "Deputy Reynolds." Sophia acknowledged, her tone carefully neutral. "Your reputation precedes you." "Does it now?" Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "And what reputation would that be, Miss Harmon?" Sophia Harmon of the Arizona Herald. Recognition flashed across Reynolds' face, quickly concealed, but not before Ethan caught it. He knew who Sophia was, or at least knew of her. "The reporter," Reynolds said, his casual tone at odds with the sudden tension in his posture. "The one asking questions about land deals and missing women, questions that have certain people very concerned." "People like Judge Sullivan," Ethan suggested, watching his old friend's reaction closely. Reynolds' expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, wariness perhaps, or calculation. "That's a dangerous name to throw around out here, Ethan, especially for a man in your position." "And what position would that be?" "Harboring a fugitive, killing 2 lawmen, fleeing arrest." Reynolds listed the charges dispassionately. "There's a warrant out for you, signed by Sullivan himself. Every lawman in the territory will be looking for you by now." Ethan's hand drifted closer to his Colt. "Those men weren't lawmen, Thomas. They were vultures sent to kill me on Sullivan's orders. You know damn well I wouldn't gun down real deputies." "Do I?" Reynolds challenged. "It's been 5 years, Ethan. People change. God knows I have." The admission hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Reynolds had changed, that much was evident in the hardness of his gaze, the new lines carved into his face. But how deep did those changes go? Whose side was he really on? "We're headed to Phoenix," Ethan said carefully, "to speak with Judge Holloway about corruption in the territorial court, about Sullivan's connection to the Vultures and the Arizona Central Development Company." Reynolds' expression remained impassive. "That's a long ride with a lot of open country between here and there. Country where accidents happen all too easily." "Is that a threat?" Sophia demanded, stepping forward despite Ethan's warning glance. "No, Miss Harmon, it's a reality." Reynolds sighed suddenly, looking older, wearier. "Sullivan has men everywhere, lawmen, ranchers, station masters. Eyes watching every road, every trail. You won't make it 10 miles before they find you." "Unless," Ethan prompted, hearing the unspoken qualifier in his old friend's tone. Reynolds met his gaze directly. "Unless you have help, someone who knows which routes are being watched, which aren't. Someone with a badge that might get you through checkpoints without questions." "Someone like you," Sophia concluded, skepticism evident in her voice. "Why would you help us?" Ethan asked, studying the man who had once been like a brother to him. "You're a deputy marshal now. Helping us would be risking your career, maybe your life." Reynolds was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the lightening sky as if seeking answers in the fading stars. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, haunted. "I was there, Ethan, at the clinic after the Vultures attacked. I saw what they did to those people, to Rebecca. I helped you bury her, remember?" Ethan remembered. The raw earth of the grave, the weight of Rebecca's body wrapped in a simple shroud, Reynolds' hand on his shoulder offering comfort that couldn't penetrate the numbness enveloping him. "Something never sat right with me about that day," Reynolds continued. "The timing of it all. The raid on the canyon was supposed to be secret, only those directly involved knew the details. Yet somehow the Vultures were prepared. Somehow they knew to hit the clinic at the exact moment our attention was elsewhere. The implication was clear, and it aligned with what Sophia had already suggested. The raid had been compromised from the beginning, a deliberate setup. "You think someone betrayed us," Ethan said flatly. Reynolds nodded. "I know someone did. I've spent 5 years trying to figure out who, watching, gathering scraps of information. Sullivan's name keeps coming up, connections to the Vultures, to the development company." He turned to Sophia. "Your articles started hitting too close to the truth. That's why they sent men after you, the same reason they finally decided to deal with Ethan after all this time." You're both loose ends in a conspiracy that's about to pay off in a big way with the Land Commission hearing. So you'll help us reach Phoenix, Sophia pressed, still wary. I'll try Reynolds qualified. No guarantees in this life, Miss Harmon. But I know a route that might get you there in one piece through the high country, then down through Deep Dead Man's Pass. It's dangerous terrain, but Sullivan's men avoid it. Too easy to get lost, too hard to track anyone through it. Ethan exchanged a glance with Sophia, a silent communication passing between them. Trust was a scarce commodity, especially given the circumstances, but Reynolds had been his closest friend once. If anyone deserved the benefit of the doubt, it was him. All right, Ethan decided. We'll follow your lead, Thomas. But understand this, if you're playing us false, if this is some kind of trap, you'll put a bullet in me. Reynolds finished with a grim smile. Fair enough. I'd expect nothing less. As they prepared to break camp, Ethan found himself watching Reynolds with a mixture of hope and suspicion. The reappearance of his old friend seemed almost too convenient, the offer of help too timely. Yet there was a sincerity in Reynolds' eyes that Ethan wanted to believe, a hint of the man he'd once trusted with his life. Sophia, for her part, maintained a careful distance from Reynolds, her expression guarded. She had more reason than most to be skeptical of lawmen given what they now suspected about the territorial justice system. The sun crested the eastern mountains as they mounted up, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. Ahead lay an uncertain path fraught with danger and deception. Behind them, the echoes of a past neither could escape. As they rode out, following Reynolds' lead, Ethan found himself haunted by the name that had surfaced in his dreams, Logan. Why did it seem significant? Why did it feel connected to everything that was happening? The answer lingered just beyond his grasp, like a half-remembered melody from a song long forgotten. One thing was certain, though, the journey to Phoenix would reveal truths none of them were prepared to face. The high country stretched before them like a primordial landscape, jagged peaks piercing the azure sky, pine forests blanketing the slopes in emerald shadows, streams carving silvery paths through ancient stone. Three riders, small against the vast wilderness, followed a narrow trail that twisted between the towering sentinels of the mountain range. Thomas Reynolds led the way, his broad shoulders set with the confidence of a man who knew the land intimately. Ethan followed, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, one hand never far from his Colt. Sophia brought up the rear, here posture betraying the pain of her broken arm, despite her stoic silence. They had been riding for 2 days, pushing deeper into the mountains, following game trails and old native paths that hadn't seen regular travel in decades. Reynolds had proven himself a capable guide, finding water when supplies ran low, selecting defensible campsites as night fell. Yet Ethan's wariness remained. Trust once broken was not easily rebuilt, especially when lives hung in the balance. We'll rest here, Reynolds announced, reining in his horse beside a small meadow nestled between towering pines. A stream gurgled nearby, clear and cold from the mountain snowmelt. Good water, good cover, and we can see anyone approaching from 3 directions. Ethan dismounted, wincing as stiff muscles protested the movement. 5 years of relative inactivity had taken their toll. His body no longer adapted easily to long days in the saddle. How much farther to Promise Creek? Another day, maybe 2, Reynolds replied, helping Sophia down from her mare. Depends on the weather. There's a storm building over the western peaks. If it hits, we'll need to find shelter and wait it out. Sophia nodded her thanks for the assistance, though her expression remained guarded. Of the 3, she had spoken least during their journey, conserving her strength, watching, evaluating. Now as she moved to help unpack their supplies, she broke her silence. Deputy Reynolds, she began, her tone carefully neutral. You mentioned Sullivan's men are watching most routes to Phoenix. What makes you so certain they're not watching this one? Reynolds smiled grimly as he unsaddled his horse. Because I'm the one who suggested they focus their resources elsewhere. As far as the territorial office knows, this route is too treacherous for anyone but experienced mountain men. And they trust your assessment? Ethan asked the question loaded with unspoken meaning. Reynolds met his gaze directly. I've spent 5 years building a reputation as Sullivan's man, Ethan. Had to if I wanted to stay close enough to learn the truth. The implication hung in the air between them, a revelation that shifted the ground beneath Ethan's feet. Reynolds, his closest friend, had been playing a dangerous game all this time, pretending loyalty to the very people responsible for Rebecca's death. You infiltrated them, Ethan said, realization dawning. You've been investigating Sullivan from the inside. Not officially, Reynolds clarified, beginning to gather wood for a small, smokeless fire. After the raid, after you left, I requested a transfer to the territorial office. Wanted to understand what went wrong, how the vultures knew we were coming. He paused, his weathered face tightening with controlled anger. It didn't take long to see the corruption. Sullivan's name kept appearing in connection with cases involving the vultures, charges, reduced witnesses, recanting evidence, disappearing. Why didn't you report it? Sophia asked, her skepticism evident. Take it up the chain of command. Reynolds laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. To whom Miss Harmon, the territorial governor, appointed Sullivan. The federal marshals were being systematically replaced with men loyal to him. Even Judge Holloway in Phoenix, as honest as they come, has limited power against the territorial machine Sullivan's built. So you played along, Ethan concluded, understanding, filling the hollow spaces of a friendship he'd thought lost. Made them believe you were one of them. It was the only way, Reynolds confirmed quietly, the only way to stay alive long enough to find proof to build a case that couldn't be buried or dismissed. Night was falling rapidly, the last golden rays of sunset replaced by the cool silver of starlight. The small fire Reynolds had built cast dancing shadows across their faces, illuminating the lines of weariness, determination, and suppressed hope. What changed? Sophia asked, accepting a cup of coffee from Reynolds with her good hand. Why risk everything to help us now? Reynolds stared into the flames as if reading answers in the glowing embers. Two things. First, Miss Harmon's articles started connecting dots I'd been trying to link for years. Then Sullivan issued that warrant for Ethan, a man who'd been living as a recluse, posing no threat to anyone. He looked up, meeting Ethan's gaze. It told me they were cleaning house, eliminating anyone who might interfere with the Land Commission hearing, which meant they were finally vulnerable, worried enough to make mistakes. A comfortable silence fell as they ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, each lost in private thoughts. The mountains loomed around them, ancient and indifferent to the human dramas playing out beneath their towering peaks. Later, as Reynolds took first watch and Sophia prepared her bedroll, Ethan found himself drawn to the edge of the meadow. The night sky spread above him, a vast canvas of stars scattered like diamond dust across velvet darkness. Somewhere in that infinity, he wondered, was Rebecca watching? Did some essence of her spirit linger, guiding his steps toward justice for her murder? Beautiful, isn't it? Sophia's voice was soft behind him. She moved to stand at his side, her profile illuminated by starlight, her injured arm cradled protectively against her chest. Diana loved the stars, said they were the same no matter where you were, so we were never truly separated. Rebecca said something similar. Ethan admitted, the memory surfacing like a bubble from the depths. On nights when I had to leave for an assignment, she'd tell me to look up at the North Star. Said as long as we could see the same star, we were connected. Sophia smiled, a fleeting expression quickly replaced by solemnity. Do you trust him? She asked, nodding toward Reynolds' silhouette by the fire. Truly. Ethan considered the question, weighing years of friendship against the bitter lessons of betrayal. I want to, he answered honestly. The Thomas Reynolds I knew was a good man, an honorable lawman. If what he says is true, if he's been working against Sullivan all this time. That's not an answer, Sophia pointed out gently. No, it's not, Ethan acknowledged. I trust him enough to follow his lead through these mountains. Beyond that, he shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the uncertainties that lay ahead. Sophia nodded, accepting his caution as reasonable. I've learned to question everything in my line of work. Everyone has motives, angles, secrets, even those closest to us. Her words carried a weight that suggested personal experience, a lesson learned at significant cost. Ethan found himself wondering about her past, about the path that had led her to become an investigative reporter willing to risk her life for the truth. Your sister, he began cautiously. Diana, you said you had an argument before she left for Prescott. Sophia's expression shuddered, a door closing against painful memories. Yes, a stupid, meaningless disagreement that somehow became the last words we ever exchanged. She turned away, her gaze fixed on the distant peaks as if they might offer some comfort. Diana wanted me to join her at the clinic, said they needed more nurses with experience. I had just started at the Herald, had my first real assignment. I told her my career was in journalism, not medicine. The regret in her voice was palpable, a living thing that breathed between her words. She accused me of abandoning our family tradition, 3 generations of Harmon women had been healers. I accused her of trying to control my life, of refusing to see me as my own person. Ethan remained silent, recognizing her need to voice these memories, to release the poison of regret they carried. The last thing I said to her, Sophia continued, her voice barely above a whisper, was that she could keep her clinic in her self-righteousness, that I didn't need either. 2 weeks later, she disappeared. She turned back to Ethan, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. 5 years, Mr. Blackwood. 5 years of following every lead, interviewing every person who might have seen her, searching for any clue to what happened, until finally I found the connection to Sullivan, to the vultures, to your wife. Ethan understood then that Sophia Harmon's pursuit of justice wasn't merely professional ambition or abstract principle. It was atonement, a desperate attempt to make right a final moment that could never be changed. Rebecca and I argued that morning too. He found himself saying the confession, emerging unbidden. The day of the raid, she wanted me to postpone it, said something felt wrong, that we needed more time to prepare. The memory was painful, dredged from the depths where he'd buried it along with so much else. I dismissed her concerns, told her she was being overprotective, that I knew what I was doing. My last words to her were a promise to be home for supper, a promise I couldn't keep. Their shared grief hung in the air between them, creating a bond deeper than mere circumstances or common purpose. Two souls marked by the same tragedy, carrying the same burden of final words that could never be unsaid. We should rest, Sophia said finally, her voice steadier. Tomorrow will be another long day. Ethan nodded, though sleep seemed an unlikely prospect. As they turned back toward the camp, Sophia paused, her hand lightly touching his arm. Thank you, she said simply, for understanding. Before he could respond, she moved away, returning to her bedroll near the fire. Ethan remained a moment longer, his gaze returning to the stars, to the North Star that had once connected him to Rebecca. I'm trying, he whispered to the vast, uncaring sky. I'm trying to make it right. When he finally settled into his own bedroll, exhaustion claimed him quickly. His dreams were a tumble of images, Rebecca smiling in their garden, Diana's face from the photograph, Sophia's eyes filled with unshed tears, and through it all, that name again, Logan. Always Logan, spoken in a voice he almost recognized, almost remembered. Morning brought clouds gathering on the western horizon, confirming Reynolds' prediction of an approaching storm. They broke camp quickly, eager to cover as much ground as possible before the weather forced them to seek shelter. As they rode, the landscape grew increasingly rugged, the trail narrowing until they were forced to proceed single file through passages barely wide enough for a horse. Reynolds led them confidently through this maze of stone and pine, occasionally pointing out landmarks, a lightning-struck tree, a distinctive rock formation that marked their progress. The Carver's place should be just ahead, he announced as they crested a ridge around midday. Old homestead, abandoned now, but the buildings are still sound. We can rest the horses there, maybe wait out the storm if it hits early. Ethan frowned, the name stirring a vague recollection. Carver, Jacob Carver, the rancher who lost his water rights in that dispute a few years back. Reynolds nodded grimly. The same. Sullivan ruled against him, claimed the creek running through Carver's land belonged to the development company under some obscure mineral rights clause. Without water, the ranch couldn't survive. Jacob held out for almost a year before giving up. What happened to him? Sophia asked, guiding her mare carefully down the steep trail. Officially moved east to stay with family, Reynolds replied. Unofficially, no one knows. He and his wife Sarah just disappeared one night, left everything behind, clothes, furniture, family photographs. Even their dog was still tied up outside. The implications were clear enough. Another family destroyed by Sullivan's machinations, more lives sacrificed to greed and corruption. The Carver homestead appeared before them as they descended into a small valley, a modest ranch house, a weathered barn, outbuildings scattered across what had once been productive land. Now the fields lay fallow, the garden overrun with weeds, the buildings slowly surrendering to the elements. They dismounted in the yard, the horses' hooves stirring dust that had lain undisturbed for months. Reynolds moved toward the house, checking that it was indeed abandoned, while Ethan and Sophia led the animals to the barn. Inside, the sweet smell of old hay filled the air, mixed with the mustier sense of abandonment and decay. Stalls that had once housed healthy livestock stood empty, tools hung on the walls coated with dust, and a wagon with a broken wheel occupied one corner, forever waiting for repairs that would never come. So much waste, Sophia murmured, her gaze taking in the evidence of lives disrupted, dreams destroyed. All for what? A railroad that could have been routed elsewhere, land that wasn't even theirs to claim. Ethan had no answer that could encompass the senselessness of it all. Instead, he focused on practical matters, securing the horses, checking their feed in water, ensuring they would be ready for the next leg of their journey. Reynolds rejoined them, his expression troubled. House is clear, but we're not the first visitors since the Carvers left. Someone's been using it as a way station, found food stores bedrolls. Recent within the last week or so. Vultures, Ethan asked, his hand instinctively moving to his revolver. Possibly, Reynolds acknowledged, or just travelers passing through. Either way, we should remain alert. I'll take first watch while you two get some rest. The storm broke just as they finished settling into the abandoned house. Rain lashed against the windows with biblical fury, driven by winds that howled around the eaves like tormented spirits. Lightning split the sky in blinding forks, followed almost immediately by thunder that shook the very foundations of the building. Inside, they had lit a small fire in the stone hearth, its warm glow creating an island of comfort amid the desolation. Sophia sat close to the flames, her injured arm troubling her more in the damp weather. Reynolds had taken up position by a window, watching the yard through a gap in the curtains. Ethan moved between them, restless, unsettled by both the storm and the abandoned home's melancholy atmosphere. We should reach Promise Creek by tomorrow afternoon if the weather clears, Reynolds said, breaking a silence that had stretched between them. From there, it's another 3 days to Phoenix if we push hard. Will we have time to investigate the clinic? Sophia asked, looking up from the fire. To search for any records Rebecca and Diana might have kept. Reynolds exchanged a glance with Ethan, a silent communication passing between them. It's risky, he admitted. Promise Creek is small, strangers are noticed. And Sullivan might have men watching the clinic, especially if he suspects what your sisters discovered. We can't pass so close and not try, Ethan said firmly. The need to understand what Rebecca had been investigating, what had ultimately led to her death, had become a physical ache within him. A few hours' delay won't matter if we find evidence that strengthens our case against Sullivan. Reynolds nodded slowly, conceding the point. We'll need disguise as a cover story. The town knows me as a deputy marshal. My presence will raise fewer questions than yours, Ethan. You've been officially declared dead for years, and Miss Harmon here is wanted for questioning. I can alter my appearance, Sophia offered. I've done it before for investigations. And Ethan could pose as my husband, a couple, passing through seeking medical attention for my arm. The suggestion was practical, logical. Yet something in Ethan recoiled at the idea of pretending to be anyone's husband, but Rebecca's. It felt like a betrayal, however necessary, however meaningless in the grand scheme of their mission. Reynolds, sensing his discomfort, offered an alternative. Or as her brother, that might draw less attention, create fewer questions about why you're accompanying her. Sophia glanced between them, understanding dawning in her eyes. Yes, of course. Brother and sister is more appropriate. The moment passed, but something had shifted in the atmosphere between them, an acknowledgement of boundaries of wounds still too raw to navigate casually. As night deepened and the storm gradually moved eastward, they took turns keeping watch. During his shift, Ethan explored the abandoned house, moving quietly through rooms that still contained the detritus of the Carvers' lives, books on shelves, clothes in wardrobes, dishes in cupboards. It was as if the family had simply evaporated one day, leaving behind the physical evidence of their existence, but taking their essence elsewhere. In what had clearly been a child's bedroom, Ethan found a small wooden horse lovingly carved and painted. He held it in his palm, imagining the child who had once treasured it, wondering what had become of them. Another casualty of Sullivan's greed, another life derailed for profit. The injustice of it burned in his chest, stoking the embers of purpose that had begun to glow within him. This was about more than personal vengeance. Now it was about all the families like the Carvers, all the lives destroyed by corruption and unchecked power. When Reynolds relieved him for the final watch before dawn, Ethan settled onto a makeshift pallet near the hearth. Across the dying fire, Sophia slept fitfully, her face troubled even in repose. The sight stirred something protective within him, a feeling he had thought long dead alongside Rebecca. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and dream-filled. Again, that name Logan echoed through his subconscious, connected somehow to fragments of memory he couldn't quite grasp. a woman's voice calling out in desperation. The crack of gunfire, blood on snow. None of it made sense yet, all of it felt significant, as if pieces of a puzzle were slowly assembling themselves at the edges of his awareness. He woke with a start, disoriented, his hand reaching instinctively for his revolver. The house was quiet, gray dawn light filtering through the curtains. Reynolds was nowhere to be seen, but Sophia stood by the window watching something outside. "Thomas is checking the perimeter," she said without turning. He thought he heard something during his watch. Ethan joined her at the window, following her gaze to the tree line beyond the yard. Nothing moved in the early morning stillness, yet he felt the same unease that had apparently prompted Reynolds' reconnaissance. "Something feels wrong," he murmured, more to himself than to Sophia. She nodded, her expression grave. "I know. It's too quiet. No birds, no small animals." They were the observations of someone accustomed to danger, to reading the subtle warnings nature provided. Ethan found himself reevaluating Sophia Harmon yet again, not just a reporter, not just a woman seeking justice for her sister, but someone with experience in situations where alertness meant survival. Reynolds appeared at the edge of the yard, emerging from the trees with deliberate casualness. His posture seemed relaxed, but Ethan knew his old friend well enough to recognize the tension in his shoulders, the careful placement of each step. "We need to leave," Ethan said, already moving toward their gear. "Now." Sophia didn't question his assessment, immediately gathering her satchel and checking that the precious evidence was secure. They worked in practiced synchronicity, as if they had been partners for years rather than days. By the time Reynolds re-entered the house, they were ready to depart. "Riders," he confirmed grimly. "At least 4, maybe more, approaching from the east. They're moving cautiously, checking the trail, looking for tracks." "Vultures?" Sophia asked, securing her satchel beneath her coat. Reynolds nodded. "Most likely. We need to move fast, take the western trail through the high pass. It's treacherous after the rain, but it might be our only chance to lose them." And they slipped out the back of the house, retrieving their horses from the barn with quiet efficiency. The animals sensed their tension ears flicking nervously as they were saddled and loaded. Ethan helped Sophia mount despite her protestations that she could manage, then swung into his own saddle, checking that his rifle was secure and accessible. Reynolds led them away from the homestead via a narrow deer trail that wound behind the barn and into the dense pine forest beyond. They rode in tense silence, every sense alert for sounds of pursuit, for the crack of a branch, or the distinctive jingle of tack that would signal discovery. The forest closed around them, the trail barely visible in places, forcing them to trust the instincts of their horses and Reynolds' knowledge of the terrain. The ground was treacherous after the storm mud, sucking at hooves, exposed roots, creating hazards that could break a leg if stepped upon carelessly. They had covered perhaps 2 miles when the first shot rang out, distant but unmistakable. Their pursuers had reached the homestead, had discovered their recent presence. "Ride," Reynolds urged, spurring his horse forward. "The pass is our only chance now." They abandoned caution for speed, pushing their mounts as fast as the dangerous terrain would allow. The trail climbed steadily, switchbacking up the mountainside toward a notch visible in the ridgeline above. The high pass, their potential salvation or their doom, depending on whether they reached it before their pursuers closed the gap. More shots echoed through the forest, closer now. Ethan glanced back to see Sophia grimly holding on, her face pale with pain, as each jarring step of her horse sent waves of agony through her broken arm. Yet she made no complaint, her determination evident in the set of her jaw, the fierce concentration in her eyes. The trail narrowed further as they climbed, hemmed in by sheer rock faces on one side and a precipitous drop on the other. Single file now, they pushed onward, the horses breathing heavily, foam flecking their necks as they strained against the steep incline. A bullet whined past Ethan's ear, sparking off the rock face beside him. Their pursuers had visual contact now and were close enough for gunfire to be more than just intimidation. "Keep going," Reynolds shouted from ahead. "The pass is just around this bend." Ethan turned in his saddle, drawing his rifle in one fluid motion. The trail behind them was momentarily empty, but movement among the trees below betrayed the presence of their hunters. 4 riders, as Reynolds had estimated, pushing their horses up the same treacherous path. Taking careful aim, Ethan fired twice, not expecting to hit at such a distance, but hoping to slow their advance to make them more cautious. The riders scattered, seeking cover among the trees, buying precious seconds for their escape. The pass, when they reached it, was little more than a narrow cleft in the ridge, barely wide enough for a horse and rider to squeeze through. Beyond it, the trail trail descended sharply into another valley, this one shrouded in morning mist that obscured the path ahead. "I'll hold them here," Reynolds decided, dismounting at the entrance to the pass. "You two go ahead, follow the trail down to the valley floor. It joins the old mining road about 5 miles ahead that'll take you straight to Promise Creek." "We're not leaving you behind," Ethan protested, even as he recognized the tactical necessity of the plan. Reynolds smiled grimly, checking the ammunition in his rifle. "Not planning on dying today, old friend. Just giving you a head start. I know these mountains better than they do. I'll lose them and catch up with you in Promise Creek." There was no time to argue. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, their hunters regrouping after Ethan's warning shots. Sophia had already guided her horse through the narrow pass, understanding the urgency of their situation. "Promise Creek," Ethan confirmed, clasping Reynolds' shoulder briefly. "Don't be late." "Wouldn't dream of it," Reynolds replied, taking up position behind a boulder that provided cover while commanding the approach to the pass. "Now go." And Ethan, he hesitated, something unspoken in his eyes. "Be careful who you trust, even in Promise Creek. Sullivan's influence reaches further than you might expect." With that cryptic warning, he turned his attention to the trail below, rifle ready. Ethan hesitated a moment longer, torn between loyalty to his friend and the necessity of continuing their mission. Then, with a silent promise to return, if Reynolds didn't appear as planned, he guided his horse through the narrow pass and into the mist beyond. The descent into the valley was treacherous, the trail slick with mud from the previous night's storm, visibility limited by the clinging mist that transformed familiar landmarks into ghostly, unrecognizable shapes. Ethan led the way, picking a careful path down the steep incline, constantly glancing back to ensure Sophia followed safely. Behind them, the sporadic crack of rifle fire echoed from the pass, Reynolds engaging their pursuers, buying time for their escape. Each shot tightened the knot of guilt in Ethan's stomach, the knowledge that he had left his friend to face danger alone. Yet practicality overrode sentiment. Continuing toward Promise Creek, toward the evidence that might bring down Sullivan and the vultures, was their only hope of achieving justice for everyone who had suffered. "He'll be all right," Sophia said, reading his thoughts with uncanny accuracy. "He knows what he's doing." Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The bond between marshals was something civilians rarely understood, a brotherhood forged in shared danger, in the knowledge that your life might depend on the man riding beside you. He had abandoned that brotherhood 5 years ago, retreating into grief and isolation. Now it pulled at him again, demanding loyalty, action, sacrifice. The gunfire grew more distant as they descended, eventually fading altogether. Whether this meant Reynolds had successfully driven off their pursuers or had been overcome, there was no way to know. They pressed on, the mist gradually thinning as they reached lower elevations, revealing a valley lush with spring growth, wildflowers carpeting meadows, aspens shimmering with new leaves, a stream winding silver through the center of it all. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Now it represented only another stage in their increasingly desperate journey. By midday, they reached the mining road Reynolds had mentioned, a wider, more established path that showed signs of recent use. Wagon ruts cut through the mud, and hoof prints suggested regular traffic heading toward what must be Promise Creek. "We should be careful now," Sophia advised, adjusting her sling with a wince. "If Sullivan has men watching the town..." Ethan had been considering the same problem. "We need those disguises Reynolds mentioned. Something to change our appearance enough to avoid immediate recognition." They paused at a stream crossing to water the horses and assess their options. Ethan's saddlebags contained a few items that might help: a spare shirt different from his usual style, a wide-brimmed hat he rarely wore, a neckerchief that could be pulled up to partially obscure his face. Not much, but perhaps enough to prevent casual identification. Sophia's transformation was more dramatic. From her own bag, she produced a small kit that spoke of previous experience with disguise hairpins, a small pot of something that might be stage makeup, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. Working quickly despite her injured arm, she pinned her dark hair up and tucked it beneath a plain bonnet, applied the makeup to subtly alter the appearance of her cheekbones and jaw, and donned the spectacles, which changed the entire character of her face. "You've done this before," Ethan observed, impressed despite himself. Sophia smiled, the expression somehow different on her altered features. "Investigative reporting sometimes requires creative approaches, especially for a woman asking questions men don't want to answer." The reminder of her profession, of the skills and experiences that had shaped her, added another dimension to Ethan's understanding of Sophia Harmon. She was no helpless victim seeking a protector, but a determined investigator with her own methods, her own strengths. "How's the arm?" he asked, noting the careful way she held it, the lines of pain etched around her eyes despite her attempts to conceal them. "It'll hold," she replied simply, "until we finish what we came for." They continued toward Promise Creek, the mining road gradually widening, signs of human habitation becoming more frequent. A woodcutter's hut, a small farm, eventually the outlying buildings of the town itself. As they approached, Ethan felt a growing tension in his chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with memory. The last time he had ridden into Promise Creek, it had been at a gallop, responding to reports of an attack. The last time he had left it had been with Rebecca's body cradled in his arms, his world shattered beyond repair. Now, 5 years later, he returned seeking answers, justice, closure. The symmetry was not lost on him, nor was the bitter irony that his quest for truth had begun and would perhaps end in the same small frontier town. Promise Creek appeared much as he remembered it, a single main street lined with the typical establishments of a mining community, a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, various businesses catering to the needs of miners and the families that supported them. The clinic where Rebecca had worked stood at the far end of the street, a modest white building with a small cross painted above the door. "We should establish our cover before approaching the clinic," Sophia murmured as they rode slowly down the main street, aware of curious glances from townspeople. "Perhaps check into the hotel, make ourselves known as travelers passing through." Ethan nodded, guiding his horse toward the two-story building that served as Promise Creek's only hotel. The sign above the door proclaimed it the Prospector's Rest, though its weathered facade suggested little actual prosperity or restfulness. They dismounted outside, securing their horses to the hitching post. Ethan took Sophia's arm in a gesture that could be interpreted as either brotherly concern or husbandly solicitude, depending on which cover story they ultimately decided to employ. Together they entered the hotel, the bell above the door announcing their arrival. The lobby was small but clean, dominated by a reception desk behind which stood a middle-aged woman with iron gray hair pulled into a severe bun. She looked up from her ledger as they entered, assessing them with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to judging a customer's worth at a glance. "Afternoon," she greeted, her tone neutral. "Looking for a room, Joam?" "Yes, ma'am," Ethan replied, adopting a slight Texas drawl different from his natural speech. "My sister and I are traveling to Phoenix. Thought we might rest here a night or two before continuing." The woman's gaze flicked to Sophia's bandaged arm, curiosity evident in her expression. "Had some trouble on the road." "A fall," Sophia explained, her own voice pitched slightly higher than usual, her normally crisp diction softened into something more genteel. "My horse was spooked by a rattlesnake. I was hoping to have the local doctor take a look, ensure it's healing properly." "Dr. Wells has his office at the clinic down the street," the woman informed them, reaching for a room key. "Though he's often out on calls this time of day. Might have better luck in the morning." Dr. Wells. The name triggered an immediate connection in Ethan's mind. The doctor mentioned in Diana's journal entry, the one receiving payments from Sullivan for special consultations. He kept his expression neutral, with effort, aware that any reaction might be noted and remembered. "We'll try in the morning then," he agreed, accepting the key she offered. "How much for the room, Mrs. Grayson, Helen Grayson?" She named a reasonable sum which Ethan paid from the limited funds they carried. "Rooms upstairs, last door on the left. Washrooms at the end of the hall. Breakfast served from 6 to 8 extra charge." They thanked her and made their way upstairs, maintaining their disguise, until safely behind the closed door of their rented room. Only then did Ethan release the breath he'd been holding, the tension of returning to Promise Creek, of hearing Dr. Wells's name momentarily overwhelming him. The room was small but adequate, a single bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a chipped basin, a straight-backed chair beside a window that overlooked the main street. From this vantage point, the clinic was clearly visible, a fact that Ethan noted with grim satisfaction. "Dr. Wells?" Sophia said quietly, placing her satchel on the bed. "The same Dr. Diana mentioned in her journal, the one receiving payments from Sullivan." "Yes," Ethan confirmed, moving to the window to observe the town without being seen. "He was in charge of the clinic when Rebecca worked there. I met him once or twice, seemed competent enough, if somewhat distant." And he's still here? Sophia mused, joining him at the window. After everything that happened, that suggests either innocence or very deep involvement. Ethan's instinct leaned toward the latter, but he reserved judgment. 5 years was a long time. The Dr. Wells who had accepted suspicious payments might not be the same man who now served Promise Creek's medical needs. We need to get into that clinic, he said, watching as a woman with a small child entered the white building down the street. See if any of Rebecca and Diana's records survived, find any evidence of these special consultations. Agreed, Sophia replied. But we should wait until evening when the clinic is likely to be empty. Breaking in during business hours would be unnecessarily risky. The prudence of her suggestion was undeniable, yet Ethan found himself restless, impatient. After 5 years of stagnation, of emotional paralysis, the prospect of answers of justice being so close at hand made waiting almost physically painful. I'll reconnoiter the town, he decided, needing action movement. See if there's any sign of Reynolds' check if we were followed. You should rest, let that arm heal as much as possible before we move on. Sophia looked as if she might protest and then nodded reluctantly, acknowledging the sense in his plan. Be careful. Remember, we're just passing through, nothing special, nothing memorable. I remember how to blend in, Ethan assured her, checking that his revolver was concealed but accessible beneath his coat. It's part of being a marshal. Was, she corrected gently, part of being a marshal. The distinction gave him pause. Yes, he had resigned his badge 5 years ago, had walked away from the oath and responsibilities of a federal marshal. Yet something of that identity remained, some core aspect of the man he had been, that couldn't be entirely erased by grief or time. Perhaps that was what had begun to awaken within him since Sophia's arrival at his ranch, not just a desire for vengeance or justice, but a reclamation of purpose, of the self he had abandoned alongside Rebecca's grave. With a nod of acknowledgement, Ethan left the room, descending to the lobby where Mrs. Grayson still stood behind her desk. He offered a polite tip of his hat as he passed, maintaining the persona of a weary traveler, simply stretching his legs after a long ride. Outside, the afternoon sun bathed Promise Creek in golden light, softening the rough edges of the frontier, town gilding even the most weathered buildings with a temporary beauty. Ethan moved along the boardwalk with deliberate casualness, his gaze taking in details that most would overlook: the two men playing checkers outside the barbershop, the woman hanging laundry behind the general store, the child with a ball running along an alley between buildings. Ordinary scenes of frontier life, yet each person represented a potential witness or informant, each building a possible hiding place for enemies or allies. The habits of his former profession reasserted themselves naturally, as if the intervening years had been merely a temporary interruption rather than a complete abandonment. The saloon predictably offered the richest source of information. Ethan entered with the confidence of a man seeking nothing more than a drink after a dusty journey, selecting a table that allowed him to observe the room while keeping his back to a wall, another old habit that had never quite died. The bartender, a heavy-set man with an impressive mustache, nodded in greeting, but asked no questions as he served Ethan a whiskey. The other patrons, miners, mostly with a few cowboys and townsmen, mixed in, glanced at the newcomer with mild curiosity before returning to their drinks and conversations. Ethan sipped his whiskey slowly, listening to the ebb and flow of talk around him. Most of it was the usual saloon fare complaints about work, boasts about cards, or women gossip about neighbors. But occasionally names or phrases caught his attention, pieces of a puzzle he was still assembling. Sullivan's men were through here yesterday asking questions. Old Doc Wells drunk again last night, babbling about ghosts and guilt. Railroad survey crew marked the Richardson place for the depot. Each fragment potentially significant, each adding context to the larger picture of corruption and conspiracy they were tracking. Ethan committed them to memory, building a mental map of Promise Creek's connections to Sullivan and the Vultures. He was on his second whiskey, still nursing it slowly, when the saloon doors swung open to admit a man whose bearing immediately marked him as different from the miners and cowboys. He was tall, impeccably dressed, in a suit that spoke of Eastern tailoring, with the gold watch chain draped across his vest and a walking stick that appeared more decorative than functional. The room quieted momentarily at his entrance, conversations pausing as heads turned to observe the newcomer. Not a local then, but someone known to the townspeople, someone whose presence warranted attention. The man nodded to the bartender, who immediately produced a glass of what appeared to be brandy without being asked. This too spoke of familiarity of routine. The stranger took his drink to a corner table where he sat alone, his back to the wall, in a position that mirrored Ethan's own choice of seating. A professional habit, Ethan noted. The stance of someone accustomed to watching rather than being watched. Curious about our visitor, the voice came from Ethan's left, where an older man had approached his table unnoticed. The stranger was weathered by years and hard living, with a miner's calloused hands and the slightly stooped posture of someone who had spent too long in tunnels and shafts. Just enjoying my drink, Ethan replied noncommittally, though he gestured to the empty chair across from him in tacit invitation. The miner sat, placing his own glass of beer on the scarred table between them. Name's Tucker, he offered. Ezra Tucker. Been mining these parts for 30 years, man and boy. John Smith, Ethan replied, using the alias he and Sophia had agreed upon. Passing through on my way to Phoenix with my sister. Tucker chuckled, a dry sound like stones rattling in a pan. Smith, a convenient name. He didn't press the point, instead nodding toward the well-dressed stranger in the corner. That there's Jason Blackburn, represents the Arizona Central Development Company, comes through every month or so, checking on the survey work, meeting with property owners. Smooth talker, that one. Could sell sand to a desert rat. Ethan kept his expression neutral, despite the surge of interest at the company's name. Development company. They building something in Promise Creek. Railroad depot, Tucker confirmed, taking a swig of his beer. Least that's the plan. Been buying up land all through this valley, offering fair prices to some, not so fair to others. Those that don't want to sell, well, he shrugged eloquently. Accidents happen. Mines collapse. Houses burn. Bad luck seems to follow the stubborn ones. The pattern was familiar now. The same tactics used elsewhere along the proposed railroad route. The same combination of financial pressure and violent intimidation to secure the land Sullivan and his associates coveted. Sounds like progress, Ethan commented, careful to keep his tone disinterested. Progress always costs somebody something. Tucker studied him over the rim of his glass eyes, sharp despite his weathered appearance. That it does, Mr. Smith. That it does. He drained his beer and stood nodding once in farewell. Enjoy your stay in Promise Creek, however brief it might be. The words could have been a simple pleasantry, yet something in Tucker's tone suggested deeper meaning, a warning perhaps, or an acknowledgement that John Smith wasn't merely passing through by chance. Ethan remained at his table for another half hour, observing Blackburn, without appearing to do so, noting who approached the company man and who avoided him. The information gathered was minimal, but potentially useful. Blackburn was clearly respected or feared by the townspeople, his connection to the development company granting him a status above that of ordinary visitors. When Blackburn finally left the saloon, Ethan waited a few minutes before following, maintaining a discreet distance as the company man moved down the main street toward, interestingly, the clinic. Dr. Wells emerged to greet him, the two men shaking hands with the familiarity of regular associates before disappearing inside. Another connection confirmed Wells in the development company, likely through Sullivan. The web of corruption extended through Promise Creek just as it did through other communities along the railroad's path. Ethan was so focused on this observation that he almost missed the figure watching him from an alley across the street, almost, but not quite. Years of training couldn't be entirely forgotten. His peripheral vision caught the movement, the deliberate stillness that followed the sense of being observed with intent. Without changing his pace or giving any indication that he'd noticed his observer, Ethan continued down the street past the general store toward the livery stable at the edge of town. Only when he had passed several buildings did he risk a glance back, catching a glimpse of a man emerging from the alley following at a distance calculated to avoid detection. The hunter had become the hunted. Someone in Promise Creek had recognized Ethan Blackwood beneath the disguise of John Smith, or at least suspected enough to warrant surveillance. The question was, who? And how much did they know about Sophia, about their mission, about the evidence they sought? Reynolds's warning echoed in his memory. Be careful who you trust, even in Promise Creek. Sullivan's influence reaches further than you might expect. As Ethan turned toward the hotel, preparing to lead his shadow on a circuitous route that might reveal their identity or purpose, a new urgency pressed upon him. They needed to access the clinic tonight, retrieve whatever evidence might remain, and leave Promise Creek before the net of suspicion closed around them completely. Time already their enemy had just become even more precious. Twilight descended over Promise Creek like a funeral shroud, shadows lengthening across the main street as lamps flickered to life in windows. Ethan slipped into the hotel room, closing the door quietly behind him. Sophia looked up from where she sat by the window, her altered features tightening with concern at his expression. "We're being watched," he said without preamble, moving to the window to scan the street below. "Someone recognized me, or at least suspects enough to have me followed." Sophia absorbed this information with the calm of someone accustomed to danger. "Did you see who it was?" "No, professional kept their distance, used the crowd for cover." Ethan spotted his shadow now, a nondescript man loitering outside the saloon across the street, his attention too casually fixed on the hotel. There, by the hitching post. She joined him at the window, careful to remain concealed behind the curtain. Not one of the vultures, at least, not obviously. Too subtle. Agreed. Could be local law or a private investigator hired by Sullivan. Ethan turned from the window, his mind racing through options, contingencies. "We need to move tonight. The clinic then out of town before they realize exactly who we are and what we're after." Sophia nodded, already gathering her essential belongings. "What about Reynolds if he escaped our pursuers at the pass?" "We can't wait," Ethan interrupted, though the decision pained him. "If Thomas made it, he'll find us on the road to Phoenix. If not..." He left the grim alternative unspoken. As they prepared for their nocturnal expedition, Ethan briefed Sophia on what he'd learned in the saloon, the presence of Jason Blackburn from the development company, his meeting with Dr. Wells, the patterns of intimidation that mirrored those in other communities along the railroad road. "It's all connected," Sophia murmured, adjusting her sling to better conceal her arm beneath a dark shawl. "Wells Sullivan, the development company, the vultures, different faces of the same operation." Ethan checked his revolver, ensuring it was loaded and functioning smoothly. "The question is, what exactly Rebecca and Diana discovered? What evidence was so damning that Sullivan ordered their elimination?" Sophia's expression hardened with renewed determination. "Let's find out." They waited until full darkness had settled over Promise Creek, until the saloon was in full swing and most townsfolk had retired to their homes. Their watcher remained at his post, but appeared less attentive, now perhaps lulled by hours of inactivity into believing his quarry had settled for the night. They slipped out through the hotel's back entrance, using the network of alleys behind the main street to approach the clinic unseen. The white building stood dark and silent, its windows shuttered, no light suggesting the presence of Dr. Wells or any patients requiring overnight care. "Service entrance," Ethan whispered, guiding Sophia toward the rear of the building. Years of enforcing the law had given him an unfortunate knowledge of how to circumvent it when necessary. The back door was locked as expected, but the mechanism was simple, a basic tumbler lock that yielded to Ethan's pocket knife after a minute of careful manipulation. They entered cautiously, pausing to listen for any sound that might indicate they weren't alone. Silence greeted them, broken only by the faint creaking of the old building settling for the night. Moonlight filtered through the windows, casting eerie patterns across the examination room, where they found themselves a table in the center cabinets, along the walls the scent of carbolic acid and medicinal herbs hanging in the air. "Rebecca mentioned a basement," Ethan murmured, recalling Diana's journal entry, "where financial records were kept." They searched methodically, moving from room to room with the quiet efficiency of practiced investigators. The clinic was larger than it appeared from outside, with several examination rooms, a small surgery, and what appeared to be private quarters for Donder. Wells, the latter locked more securely than the exterior door had been. Sophia discovered the basement entrance behind a storage cabinet in the rear hallway, a door cunningly designed to blend with the surrounding wall when closed. It opened with a protesting groan that seemed thunderous in the quiet building, revealing a set of steep wooden stairs descending into darkness. Ethan produced a small bullseye lantern from his coat, a precaution he'd taken before leaving the hotel, and lit it, adjusting the shield to emit only a narrow beam of light. Together, they descended into the clinic's hidden lower level. The basement was unexpectedly spacious, extending beneath the entire building. Stone walls glistened with moisture, the air noticeably cooler and heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Multiple rooms opened off a central corridor, their purposes not immediately apparent in the limited illumination of the lantern. "Look for records, filing cabinets, anything that might contain documentation," Ethan instructed, moving toward the first door on their right. Inside, they found what appeared to be a storage room for medical supplies, Shelves lined with bottles, bandages, and instruments all meticulously organized. Nothing immediately relevant to their investigation, though Ethan noted that many of the medications were expensive opiates and sedatives far more than a small-town clinic would typically stock. The second room yielded more promising results, a small office containing a desk filing cabinets and shelves of ledgers. Sophia immediately moved to the cabinets, rifling through folders with practiced efficiency despite her injured arm. Patient records, she reported, scanning quickly through the files, organized by name dating back several years. Ethan turned his attention to the ledgers, finding financial records that documented the clinic's operation expenses, income, salaries. On the surface, everything appeared legitimate, the accounting meticulous and transparent. Yet something felt wrong. The records were too perfect, too consistent. In his experience, even the most honest businesses showed irregularities, periods of feast or famine, unexpected expenses, or windfalls. These ledgers told a story of unwavering stability that strained credulity. There must be another set of books, he muttered, searching the shelves more carefully. These are for show for anyone who might investigate officially. Sophia paused in her examination of the files, frowning. Many of these patient records seem fabricated as well. The same handwriting for supposedly different doctors' notes, identical language in diagnoses for different conditions. Their suspicions aligned. The clinic maintained two separate realities, one for public consumption and another hidden beneath the veneer of respectability. But where was the truth concealed? The answer came as Ethan examined the desk more closely, noting that one drawer was shallower than it should have been given the exterior dimensions. Careful investigation revealed a false bottom, and beneath it a slender, leather-bound book. This ledger told a very different story. Entries were coded, but even without deciphering the specifics, the pattern was clear. Regular payments from the ACD, presumably the Arizona Central Development Company, to S.W. Sullivan Mull and G.W. Dr. Wells, with corresponding entries for services identified only by initials and dates. Sophia, Ethan called softly, an urgency in his voice that brought her immediately to his side. Look at these dates. She leaned over his shoulder, her breath warm against his cheek as she studied the entries he indicated. April 2nd and 3rd, 1880. She read recognition dawning in her eyes. The days before Rebecca and Diana disappeared. The entries for those dates were larger than most, with multiple sets of initials, and the notation TR beside several of them. Transport perhaps, or another person involved in whatever operation the clinic was concealing. There's more, Ethan said, turning to entries from the previous month. Look at these names, or initials rather. JC, SR, MH, Jacob Carver, Sarah Rankin, Martha Holdsworth. All people who disappeared from communities along the railroad route to refusing to sell their land. Sophia's expression hardened as the understanding dawned. They weren't just killed or driven off, they were taken somewhere. The implication hung in the air between them, too horrific to voice immediately. Not just a land grab, not just corruption and intimidation, but something darker: human trafficking, using the clinic as a front for processing victims who had been targeted for their property or their resistance. Rebecca and Diana figured it out, Sophia whispered, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. They connected the disappearances to the clinic, to Sullivan and the development company, and they paid with their lives. Ethan finished grimly, tucking the ledger into his coat. This was the evidence they needed, proof of a conspiracy that extended beyond mere corruption into organized criminal enterprise. A sound from above froze them both, the unmistakable creak of the clinic's front door opening, followed by footsteps moving across the wooden floor. Someone had entered the building, whether by chance or design, they couldn't know. Ethan extinguished the lantern, immediately plunging them into darkness, relieved only by the faint moonlight filtering down the basement stairs. They moved silently toward the exit ears, straining to track the movements above. Multiple sets of footsteps now, and voices, at least two people, perhaps more, moving with purpose rather than stealth. Not random intruders then, but someone with legitimate access or specific intent. Check the hotel, they're not there, man's voice said, clear enough to suggest he stood near the basement door. Must have spotted Williams following them. Search the building, another voice ordered, cultured, authoritative, vaguely familiar to Ethan, though he couldn't immediately place it. They're after the records. If they find what that Reed woman and the nurse discovered, Ethan and Sophia exchanged glances in the near darkness, the same realization dawning for both. Their pursuers knew exactly who they were and what they sought. The pretense of disguise and cover stories had failed. With few options remaining, Ethan led Sophia toward the farthest corner of the basement, where deep shadows offered their best chance of concealment. If the searchers descended with lanterns, however, discovery was inevitable. The basement door opened fully light, spilling down the stairs as someone above called out, "Check down there, Williams, thoroughly." Footsteps on the wooden stairs accompanied by the bobbing glow of a lantern. Ethan drew his revolver, pressing Sophia behind him in a protective gesture. She seemed inclined to resist until the gravity of their situation registered fully. The man called Williams reached the bottom of the stairs, raising his lantern to illuminate the central corridor. He was the same nondescript individual who had followed Ethan earlier, medium height, forgettable features, the kind of face that blended into crowds by design. "Come out, Blackwood," he called, his voice echoing against the stone walls. "We know you're down here. No point making this uglier than it needs to be." Ethan remained silent, calculating odds, options, escape routes. There was only one staircase with Williams blocking it and at least one other man above. Direct confrontation seemed inevitable, but perhaps they could dictate its terms. Williams moved methodically along the corridor, checking each room, his lantern casting long shadows that danced across the walls like restless spirits. When he reached the office where they'd found the ledger, he paused, noting the disturbed files, the opened desk drawer. "They found it," he called up the stairs. "The secondary ledger is gone." A curse from above, followed by the sound of more footsteps descending. Williams turned, raising his lantern higher, the light finally reaching the corner where Ethan and Sophia crouched among discarded medical equipment. For a moment, their eyes met across the basement, Williams widening in recognition, Ethan's narrowing in preparation for what must come. Then several things happened in rapid succession. Williams reached for his sidearm. Ethan surged forward, crossing the distance between them with unexpected speed. The lantern crashed to the floor as the two men collided, plunging the basement into chaotic shadows broken only by the light from the stairwell. They grappled in semi-darkness, each fighting for control of their weapons. Williams was younger, stronger, but Ethan had the desperation of a man with everything to lose and the muscle memory of countless similar confrontations from his days as a marshal. A gunshot thundered in the confined space, deafeningly loud, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the struggling figures. Williams staggered back, a look of surprise on his unremarkable face as he registered the spreading stain on his chest. His revolver clattered to the stone floor as he followed it down, collapsing with a finality that needed no confirmation. "Williams." The voice from the stairs was alarmed now, accompanied by the distinctive sound of a shotgun being cocked. "What's happening down there?" Ethan retrieved his revolver and Williams' weapon, retreating to where Sophia waited, her own small pistol drawn from some hidden pocket of her dress. Together they moved toward the rear of the basement, searching desperately for another exit, another option. "There," Sophia whispered, pointing to what appeared to be a coal chute in the farthest wall, a narrow opening that might possibly provide escape for someone desperate enough to try it. The second man was descending the stairs now, shotgun first, moving with the caution of someone expecting resistance. In the faint light from above, Ethan caught a glimpse of his face and recognized Thomas Reynolds. The shock of betrayal hit like a physical blow. Reynolds, his oldest friend, his former partner, the man who had supposedly been working against Sullivan from within. All a lie, a long con designed to identify and eliminate threats to the conspiracy. "Thomas," Ethan called, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "So this is where your investigation led you, right into Sullivan's pocket." Reynolds paused on the stairs, shotgun still leveled toward the darkness where Ethan's voice originated. "It's not what you think, Ethan. It's more complicated than that." "It seems simple enough," Ethan countered, using the conversation to allow Sophia time to work the coal chute open. "You played me from the start. Probably arranged the raid on the vultures too, made sure Rebecca and Diana were at the clinic when they came for them." "I didn't know about the women," Reynolds insisted, his voice strained with what might have been genuine regret. "That was Sullivan's order, carried out without my knowledge. By the time I realized what had happened, it was too late. And afterwards, when you supposedly spent 5 years investigating from within, the sense of betrayal was almost overwhelming, threatening to cloud Ethan's judgment when he needed it most." Reynolds descended another step, his features now visible in the dim light, haggard, conflicted, not the triumphant face of a traitor relishing his revelation, but a man haunted by his choices. I did investigate, he said quietly. Found enough to know how deep it goes, how far Sullivan's reach extends. But I also learned something else, something about you, Ethan, something you don't remember. Behind Ethan, the coal chute groaned as Sophia worked it open, the sound drawing Reynolds' attention momentarily. It was enough. Ethan fired twice, forcing his former friend back up the stairs with splintering wood and ricocheting bullets. Go, he urged Sophia, who had finally created an opening large enough to squeeze through. I'll hold him here, then follow. Not without you, she insisted, gripping his arm with surprising strength. We both go now. The determination in her eyes brooked no argument. Together they retreated to the coal chute, Ethan covering their withdrawal with carefully placed shots that kept Reynolds pinned at the top of the stairs. The opening was tight, barely wide enough for an adult to pass through, and would deposit them into the alley behind the clinic exposed, but with a chance of reaching their horses before pursuit could be organized. Sophia went first, her smaller frame and determination compensating for her injured arm as she wriggled through the narrow passage. Ethan followed the confined space, awakening a claustrophobia he hadn't known he possessed, the rough stone scraping his shoulders as he forced himself through. Behind them, Reynolds had reached the bottom of the stairs, shotgun abandoned for a revolver more suited to the basement's confines. Ethan, wait, there's more you need to know. About Logan. That name again. Logan, the one that had haunted Ethan's dreams since Sophia's arrival. Reynolds knew something about him, something important enough to risk revealing even in this moment of confrontation. But there was no time for explanations or revelations. Ethan continued through the chute, emerging behind Sophia into the cool night air of the alley. They ran immediately, not toward the hotel where their belongings remained, but directly to the livery stable where their horses were kept. The stable boy, awakened by their urgent arrival, asked no questions when Ethan pressed extra coins into his hand. Within minutes, they were mounted and riding out of Promise Creek, leaving behind the scene of multiple tragedies: Rebecca's death, Diana's disappearance, and now the revelation of Reynolds' betrayal. Only when they had put several miles between themselves and the town did they slow their pace, allowing the horses to recover while they considered their next move. Reynolds knew about Logan, Sophia said, breaking the tense silence that had enveloped them since their escape. That name from your dreams. Ethan nodded, his mind still reeling from the night's revelations. He said there was something I don't remember. Something about me. Sophia's expression was troubled in the moonlight, her disguise partially undone by their hasty flight, revealing the woman beneath more clearly. Ethan, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have shared earlier. The hesitation in her voice, the guilt in her eyes sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the night air. What is it? Before she could respond, the sound of approaching riders reached them, multiple horses moving at speed along the road behind them. Their pursuers from Promise Creek had organized more quickly than anticipated. Later, Sophia promised, her expression conflicted. When we're safe. Right now we need to reach Phoenix and Judge Holloway before Sullivan's men catch us, or the Land Commission hearing begins. Questions burned within Ethan about Logan, about whatever secrets Sophia was keeping. But practicality overrode curiosity. She was right. The evidence they carried was too important to risk in a confrontation they might not survive. They urged their horses forward once more, leaving the road for less traveled paths that wound through the foothills. The journey to Phoenix stretched before them, fraught with danger but unavoidable if justice was to be served. Behind them, Promise Creek receded into darkness, a town built on secrets that had claimed too many lives already. Dawn found them sheltering in an abandoned line shack miles from any established trail, the kind of place known only to cowboys and fugitives. Ethan had discovered it years ago during a manhunt, had marked its location in his mental map of the territory as a potential refuge should the need ever arise. That need had come, though, in circumstances he could never have anticipated. The shack was little more than 4 walls and a roof with a crude stone fireplace and a single window facing east. They had risked a small fire enough to brew coffee and warm their exhausted bodies after the night's ordeal. Now, as golden light spilled across the horizon, they sat in wary silence, each processing the revelations and betrayals of Promise Creek. We should continue at nightfall, Ethan said, studying the terrain visible through the window. Less chance of being spotted, and the horses need rest after pushing so hard. Sophia nodded agreement, cradling her injured arm, which had begun to trouble her more after their hasty escape. The splint Ethan had fashioned days earlier remained functional, but pain etched lines around her eyes that concern for their mission couldn't entirely mask. "Let me check that," he offered, moving to kneel beside her. Gently, he unwrapped the bandages, examining the break with careful fingers. "It's healing, but the swelling's worse. The strain of riding." "I'll manage," she assured him, though her sharp intake of breath as he probed the injury belied her stoicism. Ethan rewrapped the arm with fresh bandages from their limited supplies, his touch as gentle as his expression was troubled. When he finished, he remained kneeling before her, his gaze direct and unflinching. "You said there was something you needed to tell me," he reminded her, "something about Logan." Sophia's composure faltered briefly, a flicker of what might have been guilt crossing her features before determination reasserted itself. She reached for her satchel with her good hand, withdrawing a folded document that she handed to Ethan with visible reluctance. "I found this among Diana's personal effects after she disappeared," she explained as he unfolded what proved to be an official military record. "It's from 10 years ago during the border conflicts with Mexico." Ethan scanned the document, confusion giving way to disbelief as the words registered. It was a commendation for bravery issued to Captain Logan Mercer of the U.S. Cavalry, accompanied by a photograph that, despite differences in hairstyle and the absence of a beard, was unmistakably his own face. This isn't possible," he whispered, looking from the document to Sophia. "My name is Ethan Blackwood. I was a federal marshal, not a cavalry officer. I've never—" "You don't remember," Sophia said quietly. "That's what Reynolds meant. There are parts of your past that were taken from you, Ethan. Or should I say Logan?" The room seemed to tilt around him. Reality shifting on its axis as buried memories struggled to surface, fragments of dreams suddenly taking on the weight and texture of actual experience. Snow-covered mountains, the crack of gunfire, a woman's voice calling a name that wasn't Ethan. "How?" he demanded, his voice hoarse with emotion. "How could I forget my own name, my own past?" Sophia's expression was compassionate but unflinching. Diana's journal mentioned experiments at the clinic, patients drugged with mixtures of laudanum and other compounds that induced confusion, suggestibility, even complete amnesia in some cases. It was part of Sullivan's operation, erasing identities, creating new ones for people they wanted to control or eliminate. The implications were staggering, threatening to overwhelm Ethan's sense of self. If he wasn't Ethan Blackwood, if that identity had been constructed, implanted, then who was he? What was real and what was fabrication in the life he remembered? "Rebecca," he said, latching onto the one certainty in his suddenly uncertain existence. "My wife. Was she real?" Sophia assured him quickly. "Your marriage to her was real. Your love for her was real. But how you met her, why you met her, that may be different from what you remember." Ethan or Logan closed his eyes, attempting to bring order to the chaos of competing memories now flooding his consciousness. "Tell me what you know." "All of it." Sophia nodded, accepting the inevitability of full disclosure. 10 years ago, Captain Logan Mercer was assigned to investigate corruption within the territorial government, specifically rumors that officials were collaborating with bandits to raid settlements along the border, driving people from valuable land that was then acquired through dubious legal means. The pattern was familiar, a precursor to the current scheme involving the railroad. Ethan listened in silence as Sophia continued, each word illuminating dark corners of his fractured memory. Logan's investigation led him to a young nurse named Diana Harmon, who had treated victims of these raids and noticed inconsistencies in their stories. Together, they began gathering evidence against several officials, including a rising judicial clerk named Calvin Sullivan. Diana. The name resonated with something deep within him, triggering a cascade of images, a woman's smile different from Rebecca's, but equally beloved. Moonlight conversations on a porch, the warmth of her hand in his. We were lovers. He realized the truth emerging from some unaltered corner of his mind. Diana and I, we were planning to marry. Sophia nodded, her expression softening. Yes, Diana wrote to me about you, about how happy she was, how you'd both continue your investigation after the wedding. Then suddenly her letter stopped. When I finally traced her to Prescott, she was different, distant, almost afraid to speak to me. And she wasn't Diana Harmon anymore, but Diana Reed, using our mother's maiden name. The story unfolded like a nightmare. Logan and Diana had been ambushed while transporting evidence against Sullivan. Diana was captured while Logan was left for dead with a head wound that nearly killed him. When he recovered physically, his memories had been altered through some combination of trauma and chemical manipulation at Sullivan's clinic. They gave you a new identity, Sophia explained, her voice gentle, as if softening the impact of each revelation. Ethan Blackwood, federal marshal widower from Texas, starting fresh in Arizona. They paired you with Rebecca, Diana's younger sister, also a nurse, who physically resembled her enough to maintain any fragments of memory that couldn't be fully erased. Rebecca was Diana's sister. The relationship between the two women in the photograph suddenly made sense, the similarities in appearance despite the differences in bearing and expression. Yes, she was recruited by Sullivan, told that she was helping a traumatized officer recover by playing the role of his wife. I don't think she knew the full truth at first, that Diana was being held as leverage, that you were being used to flush out any co-conspirators from your original investigation. Ethan Logan struggled to reconcile these revelations with his memories of Rebecca, of their life together. But she loved me. That wasn't pretense. She couldn't have faked that. No, Sophia agreed softly. From what Diana later learned, Rebecca truly fell in love with you. She began to question her role in Sullivan's scheme, especially as she noticed strange patterns at the clinic where she worked, the same patterns Diana had originally investigated with you. The pieces aligned with terrible clarity. Rebecca and Diana's sisters separated by Sullivan's machinations, both eventually discovering the same conspiracy from different angles, both paying with their lives for that discovery. And you, Ethan asked, studying Sophia with new wariness. Where do you fit in this web of deception? Sophia met his gaze unflinchingly. I'm exactly who I claim to be, Diana's sister, a reporter who spent 5 years investigating her disappearance. What I didn't tell you was that I knew about Logan Mercer, about your true identity, before I ever arrived at your ranch. Why keep it from me? Why not tell me immediately? Because I wasn't certain how your mind would react to the truth, she explained. Diana's journal warned that forcing memories could trigger dangerous psychological responses, violence, catatonia, even death in some cases. I needed to approach carefully to let your original identity resurface naturally through exposure to familiar stimuli. Ethan rose abruptly, moving to the window where dawn had fully broken over the landscape. His mind felt like a battlefield where two separate identities fought for dominance. Ethan Blackwood, with his grief for Rebecca and his 5 years of solitary existence. Logan Mercer, with his mission, his love for Diana, his sense of purpose and justice. Reynolds knows, he said finally. He called me Logan in the basement. He's part of this. Yes, Sophia confirmed. Thomas Reynolds was your partner in the original investigation before you met Diana. According to her journal, he disappeared shortly after your ambush. When he resurfaced as a territorial deputy, he was working for Sullivan, Ethan finished bitterly. Another betrayal in a story built on betrayals. Or a man caught in an impossible position, Sophia suggested. His actions last night. He could have killed us easily in that basement. Instead, he tried to talk to explain. There may be more to his story than we know. Ethan wasn't ready to extend such charity to the man who had potentially betrayed him twice, once as Logan, once as Ethan. Yet Sophia's point couldn't be dismissed entirely. Reynolds had had multiple opportunities to eliminate them, if that was truly his goal. None of this changes our immediate objective, he said, turning back to face her. The evidence we found in Promise Creek, combined with what you already gathered, is still our best hope of exposing Sullivan and stopping the Land Commission hearing. Agreed, Sophia said, relief evident in her expression, perhaps because he was focusing on their mission rather than spiraling into an identity crisis. Phoenix is still a day's hard ride away. If we travel through the night, we might reach Judge Holloway by morning. Ethan nodded, his decision made. Whatever the truth of his past, whatever name he had been born with, the path forward remained clear: justice for Rebecca, for Diana, for all those whose lives had been destroyed by Sullivan's corrupt empire. As they prepared to continue their journey, resting through the day, to travel under cover of darkness, Ethan found himself watching Sophia with new eyes, seeing in her features the echoes of both Diana and Rebecca, understanding now why her presence had stirred such complex emotions within him from the beginning. She was the bridge between his fractured identities, the living connection to both the man he had been and the man he had become. In her determination to expose the truth, to achieve justice regardless of personal cost, he recognized a kindred spirit, whether as Ethan Blackwood or Logan Mercer. The sun climbed higher, casting the abandoned line shack in harsh light that revealed every crack, every imperfection in its weathered structure. Similarly illuminated were the fractures in Ethan's understanding of himself, the flaws in the narrative he had lived for 5 years. Yet within that harsh revelation lay the possibility of healing, of reconstruction, not a return to what had been, but the creation of something new from the fragments of both identities. Logan or Ethan, the core remained the same, a man dedicated to justice, willing to sacrifice everything for truth. That at least was no fabrication. Night had fallen by the time they reached the outskirts of Phoenix, the city's lights forming a constellation against the darkened landscape. They had pushed hard, avoiding main roads, taking advantage of every shortcut Ethan's knowledge of the territory provided. Their horses were near exhaustion, their own bodies little better, but the goal that had driven them across mountains and deserts now lay within reach. Judge Holloway's residence stood on the western edge of the city, a modest home for a man of his position, reflecting the austere character that had earned him a reputation for incorruptibility. Lights burned in several windows despite the late hour, suggesting the judge was still awake, perhaps working on cases for the following day. They approached cautiously, alert for any sign that Sullivan's men had anticipated their destination. The street appeared quiet, normal, yet Ethan's instincts, honed through years, as both a cavalry officer and a marshal, he now realized detected a wrongness in the stillness, a tension in the air that whispered of danger. "Something's not right," he murmured, as they tethered their horses in a stand of trees 100 yards from the judge's home. "It's too quiet." Sophia nodded, her expression grim as she secured her precious satchel of evidence. "Sullivan would have guessed our destination. If he has men in Phoenix." The implication hung between them, amplifying the urgency of their mission. If Holloway was compromised, if Sullivan had somehow reached him first, their journey might end in failure or worse. "I'll approach from the front," Ethan decided, checking his revolver one final time. "You circle around to the back. If there's trouble, use this." He handed her a small derringer from his boot, an additional weapon to the pistol she already carried. "2 shots, but at close range they'll count." Sophia accepted the weapon with a nod of thanks. "Be careful," she said, her voice softening momentarily. "We've come too far to lose now." The simple statement carried emotional weight beyond its literal meaning, a recognition of the journey they had shared, the bonds forged through danger and revelation. Ethan found himself wanting to say more, to acknowledge the complex feelings that had developed between them, but time pressed too urgently for such indulgences. "Meet you inside," he said, instead giving her shoulder a brief, reassuring squeeze before they separated, each moving toward their designated approach to the judge's home. Ethan advanced along the darkened street with the caution of a man who had learned to anticipate ambush. Each shadow concealed potential danger, each rustle of wind through leaves a possible signal between hidden watchers. Yet nothing moved, no alarms sounded as he reached the small gate that led to Holloway's front path. Too easy, his instincts whispered. Too unguarded for a man of Holloway's importance, especially on the eve of a hearing that could expose corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. The front door stood slightly ajar, another warning sign that sent Ethan's hand to his revolver. No servant would leave a judge's door unsecured at night, no matter how safe the neighborhood. Drawing his weapon, Ethan pushed the door open with his foot, entering a foyer, illuminated by a single lamp turned low. The house was silent, save for the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Ethan moved forward cautiously, ears straining for any sound that might betray another presence. The parlor to his right was dark and empty, as was the dining room beyond. Only the study at the end of the hall showed signs of occupation, light spilling from beneath the closed door, the faint scratch of a pen on paper audible in the stillness. Ethan approached the study door, every sense alert for danger. His hand had just touched the knob when a floorboard creaked behind him, the only warning before something hard connected with the back of his head, sending him sprawling into darkness. Consciousness returned gradually, accompanied by a throbbing pain that seemed to encompass his entire skull. Ethan opened his eyes to find himself bound to a chair in what appeared to be Judge Holloway's study, his weapons gone, his limbs secured with professional efficiency. Across the room, an elegantly dressed man sat behind the judge's desk, watching Ethan's return to awareness with clinical interest. He was perhaps 50, with silver threading through dark hair and cold eyes that assessed rather than observed. "Marshal Blackwood," the man said, his cultured voice confirming what Ethan already suspected. This was Judge Calvin Sullivan. "Or should I say Captain Mercer? Your resilience continues to impress even after all these years. Ethan's gaze darted around the room, seeking any sign of Sophia or Judge Holloway. The study appeared empty, save for himself and Sullivan, though the slightly ajar door to an adjacent room suggested others might be nearby. "Where is Judge Holloway?" Ethan demanded, testing his bonds subtly while maintaining eye contact with Sullivan. "What have you done with him?" Sullivan's smile never reached his eyes. "Judge Holloway is unfortunately indisposed, a sudden illness requiring immediate return to the East for treatment. Most inconvenient timing with the Land Commission hearing tomorrow, but these things happen." The casual way he discussed what was clearly a fabricated absence, or worse, an elimination, sent a chill through Ethan. This was a man accustomed to removing obstacles without remorse, to reshaping reality to suit his purposes. "And Miss Harmon," Ethan kept his tone neutral, despite the fear that clutched at his heart. "I assume your men found her as well." "Not yet," Sullivan admitted, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "Though it's only a matter of time. Phoenix is surrounded, every road watched. Even if she evaded immediate capture, she won't reach anyone who might help her." He leaned forward, studying Ethan with renewed interest. "You care for her, don't you, just as you cared for Diana? You do have a predictable weakness for Harmon women." The taunt struck its intended target, but Ethan refused to give Sullivan the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he focused on the revelations of his fragmented identity, seeking clarity that might give him an advantage. "Why, Buell?" he asked simply. "Why the elaborate charade with my memories? Why not simply kill me along with Diana when you had the chance?" Sullivan rose from the desk, moving to a sideboard where a crystal decanter of brandy waited. He poured himself a measure, the domesticity of the action incongruous with the menace that emanated from him. "Several reasons," he replied, swirling the amber liquid thoughtfully. "First, we needed to know what evidence you had gathered, who else might be involved in your investigation. Killing you would have been simpler, yes, but less informative." He sipped his brandy, savoring it with the appreciation of a connoisseur. "Second, your skills were too valuable to waste. The Blackwood identity was crafted to utilize your abilities while redirecting your inconvenient moral compass toward targets that didn't threaten our operations. You turned me into a weapon," Ethan realized, disgust coloring his tone. "Pointed me at your enemies while making me believe I was serving justice." "Precisely," Sullivan confirmed, seemingly pleased by Ethan's understanding. "You were remarkably effective in your new role, eliminated several competing criminal organizations that had become problematic, all while believing you were a righteous arm of the law." The revelation sickened Ethan, the thought that he had been used to eliminate Sullivan's competition rather than serve justice, that his believed crusade for law and order had been manipulated to strengthen the very corruption he thought he opposed. "And Rebecca," he asked the name, still carrying emotional weight, despite his now fractured understanding of their relationship. "Where did she fit in your scheme?" Something almost like regret flickered across Sullivan's face, quickly suppressed. "Rebecca Reed was initially a simple tool, physically similar enough to Diana to satisfy any lingering memories, psychologically pliable enough to accept the role we created for her. We didn't anticipate that she would develop genuine feelings for you, or that those feelings would lead her to question her assignment. When she started investigating the clinic," Ethan concluded, the pieces aligning with terrible clarity, "when she and Diana recognized each other despite your manipulations, it became necessary to tie up loose ends," Sullivan finished dispassionately. "The raid on the Vulture's hideout provided perfect cover, a tragedy of circumstance, rather than a targeted elimination." Rage built within Ethan, a cold, calculating fury different from the hot grief that had consumed him for 5 years. This wasn't just about Rebecca anymore, or Diana, or even his own fractured identity. It was about justice for everyone Sullivan had used and discarded in his relentless pursuit of power and wealth. "You won't get away with this," Ethan said, the words not a desperate hope, but a statement of intent. "The evidence Sophia and I gathered will never reach anyone who matters," Sullivan interrupted smoothly. "The ledger you stole from Promise Creek, Miss Harmon's carefully assembled documentation, all will be destroyed. The Land Commission hearing will proceed as planned tomorrow. The railroad route will be approved, and the final phase of our operation will be complete." He returned to the desk, setting down his empty glass with a decisive click. "As for you, Captain Mercer, I'm afraid your usefulness has finally come to an end. After tonight, the tragic story of Ethan Blackwood will conclude with a desperate fugitive taking his own life rather than face justice for his crimes. The study door opened fully, admitting two men whose bearing marked them as enforcers rather than mere henchmen. Sullivan nodded to them instructions requiring no verbalization after what was clearly long association. "Prepare him for transport," he ordered. "The canyon at first light. Make it convincing." The men moved toward Ethan, one producing a syringe filled with clear liquid laudanum, perhaps, or one of the memory-altering compounds Sophia had described. Before they could reach him, however, a commotion erupted somewhere in the house, a crash followed by shouting and the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. Sullivan's head snapped toward the door, his composure fracturing momentarily. "Find out what that is," he commanded one of the men, who immediately drew his weapon and moved into the hallway. The distraction, brief as it was, provided the opportunity Ethan had been waiting for. During Sullivan's monologue, he had worked steadily at his bonds, exploiting a slight weakness in the knots that secured his right wrist. Now, with a final wrench that tore skin but freed his hand, he lunged for the remaining enforcer. The man reacted quickly, bringing up the syringe like a weapon. But Ethan was faster desperation, and training combining in a move that deflected the threat and sent both men crashing into Sullivan's desk. They grappled briefly before Ethan gained the upper hand, driving his opponent's head against the heavy furniture with enough force to render him unconscious. Sullivan had retreated to the far side of the room, reaching into his coat for what Ethan assumed was a concealed weapon. Before he could draw it, the study door burst open once more, revealing Thomas Reynolds, disheveled, breathing hard, but very much alive, and pointing a revolver directly at Sullivan's heart. "Don't move, Judge," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of his martial training. "Not 1 inch." Behind Reynolds appeared Sophia, her face bloodied, but determined, the small derringer Ethan had given her still smoking in her hand. The sight of her alive fighting sent a wave of relief through Ethan, so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. "The evidence?" he asked, immediately prioritizing their mission above all else. "Safe," she confirmed, her gaze sweeping over him, assessing injuries with practiced efficiency. "Judge Holloway's clerk has it he was hiding in the cellar when Sullivan's men arrived. Reynolds found him, verified his loyalty." Reynolds, the man Ethan had believed a traitor, now standing as an ally. The confusion must have shown on his face, for Reynolds offered a grim smile as he maintained his aim at Sullivan. "Long story, old friend," he said. "The short version is, I've been playing a deeper game than either of us anticipated. Working with the governor, directly building a case against Sullivan that couldn't be dismissed or buried." "You let us think you'd betrayed us," Ethan said, of the accusation tempered by growing understanding. "At the clinic in the basement." "Had to," Reynolds replied simply. "Sullivan had men everywhere. If they'd suspected I was anything other than completely loyal—" He didn't need to finish the thought. Sullivan watched this exchange with calculating eyes, his composure regained despite the revolver pointed at his chest. "How touching," he observed coldly. "The band of righteous crusaders reunited. You do realize this changes nothing. I have connections beyond the territory influence you cannot begin to comprehend." "Perhaps," Sophia acknowledged, moving to stand beside Ethan. "But tonight that influence ends. The evidence is already being dispatched to multiple destinations. The governor, federal authorities even selected newspaper editors across the country. By morning, everyone will know what you've done, what you've been planning." Something flickered in Sullivan's eyes, the first genuine concern he'd shown since Ethan regained consciousness. "You're bluffing," he asserted, but without his previous confidence. "Am I?" Sophia countered, her smile tight with righteous satisfaction. "Diana taught me to prepare for contingencies, to never place all hope in a single path. It's why I survived 5 years of hunting your operation while others failed." Outside, the sound of approaching horses heralded new arrivals' reinforcements, for which side Ethan couldn't be certain. Reynolds moved to the window, peering cautiously around the edge of the curtain. "Governor's men," he reported with evident relief. "Right on schedule." Sullivan's mask of control finally slipped, revealing the rage and desperation beneath. With surprising speed for a man of his age and bearing, he lunged toward the desk, reaching for a hidden drawer that presumably contained a weapon. Ethan moved faster, crossing the space between them in 2 strides and delivering a blow that sent Sullivan crashing to the floor. The judge lay stunned, blood trickling from a split lip, his carefully cultivated image of power and control shattered along with his plans. As Reynolds secured Sullivan with the same ropes that had bound Ethan moments earlier, Sophia moved to Ethan's side, her hand finding his in a gesture that conveyed more than words could express. Together they watched as the architect of so much suffering, so much loss was finally rendered powerless, a fitting prelude to the justice that would follow. Outside, the first light of dawn broke over Phoenix, heralding not just a new day, but the possibility of a new beginning for the territory for the victims of Sullivan's schemes, and perhaps for the man who had been both Ethan Blackwood and Logan Mercer. The boundary between truth and lies had finally been crossed. What lay beyond remained to be discovered. The territorial courthouse in Phoenix buzzed with unprecedented activity as the sun climbed toward its zenith. Word of Judge Sullivan's arrest had spread through the city with the speed of a prairie fire, drawing spectators, journalists, and concerned citizens to the hastily convened emergency hearing that had replaced the scheduled Land Commission proceedings. Ethan stood at the back of the crowded courtroom, preferring the anonymity of the shadows to the exposure of the witness stand he had occupied earlier. His testimony, the fractured recollections of both Logan Mercer and Ethan Blackwood, had been delivered to a shocked audience, the tale of memory manipulation and elaborate conspiracy, sounding more like dime novel fiction than territorial justice. Yet the evidence supported every claim: the ledger from Promise Creek, Diana's journal, Sophia's meticulous documentation of land seizures and disappearances, Reynolds' accumulated observations from 5 years of covert investigation. Together they painted an undeniable picture of corruption that extended through every level of territorial government, with Sullivan at its center. The judge himself sat at the defendant's table, his elegant attire incongruous with the manacles that secured his wrists. His expression remained one of contemptuous boredom, as if the proceedings were beneath his notice, a facade undermined by the tension evident in his posture, the occasional darting of his eyes toward exits and windows. Sophia occupied a seat near the front, her broken arm properly set and cast by a physician the governor had summoned specifically for her treatment. Despite the pain she must still be experiencing, her bearing was straight, her attention unwavering as each piece of evidence was presented, each witness examined and cross-examined. Reynolds stood nearby in his capacity as a federal marshal, his true allegiance revealed at last, his deception explained as necessary to maintain his deep cover investigation. The governor had personally reinstated his original commission, acknowledging the sacrifices and risks Reynolds had undertaken to expose Sullivan's organization. As the testimony concluded, and the specially appointed judge of Federal Circuit Justice brought in from California to ensure impartiality called for closing statements, Ethan felt a presence at his side. Turning, he found Maria Vasquez, the Mexican woman who had helped them in Tucson, whose son had disappeared into Sullivan's trafficking operation. "Senor Blackwood," she greeted him softly, her dark eyes searching his face. "Or is it Mercer? Now I am not sure what to call you." "Ethan is fine," he replied, the question of his true identity still unresolved even in his own mind. "I didn't expect to see you here, Maria." She smiled faintly, the expression tinged with both hope and apprehension. "Miss Harmon sent word, said today they might speak of the missing ones, that I should come if I wished to learn of Alejandro. The missing ones, those who had disappeared not just from Promise Creek, but from communities across the territory, victims of Sullivan's multifaceted criminal enterprise. Among the evidence presented had been records suggesting many had been transported to mining operations in Mexico, forced labor, hidden from territorial jurisdiction. "There's a chance, Maria," Ethan said gently, unwilling to offer false hope, but equally unwilling to extinguish what might be genuine possibility. "The governor has already dispatched representatives to the locations mentioned in Sullivan's records. If Alejandro is there—" Maria nodded, her hands clutched around a small medallion that Ethan recognized as a religious icon, Saint Anthony, patron of lost things and missing persons. "I pray every day," she said simply. "Now perhaps someone listens." Before Ethan could respond, a commotion erupted at the courtroom doors, raised voices, the sound of a scuffle. Then suddenly armed men bursting into the chamber with weapons drawn, the vultures making a desperate attempt to free their benefactor before justice could be fully served. The courtroom erupted into chaos, spectators diving for cover, the bailiffs drawing weapons, Reynolds moving to protect the judge and evidence. Ethan's first instinct was to find Sophia to ensure her safety amid the violence that had followed them from the moment they joined forces. He spotted her crouched behind the witness stand, vulnerable, but remarkably composed, her eyes meeting his, across the tumultuous room with a clarity that communicated more than words. She was pointing, directing his attention to Sullivan, who had used the distraction to slip his bonds, likely with help from a Confederate in the confusion, and was moving toward a side exit with the swift purpose of a man making his final escape. Ethan moved without conscious thought, years of training guiding his actions as he vaulted over benches, pushed through panicked spectators, and closed the distance to Sullivan with single-minded determination. The judge saw him coming, his composed mask finally cracking to reveal the desperation beneath. "It's over, Sullivan," Ethan called above the din of the chaotic courtroom. "There's nowhere left to run." Sullivan's response was to draw a small derringer from within his coat, a hidden weapon missed in earlier searches, and aim it not at Ethan, but at Sophia, who had emerged from behind the witness stand to help an elderly woman seeking shelter from the violence. "Perhaps," Sullivan acknowledged, his voice cold with finality, "but I can still ensure she joins her sister in whatever afterlife you believe in." Time seemed to slow as Ethan registered the threat, calculated distances and angles, recognized the impossibility of reaching either Sullivan or Sophia before the judge could fire. In that stretched moment, he made the only choice possible, hurling himself into the line of fire as Sullivan's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot was lost amid the general chaos, but the impact of the bullet was undeniable, a hot punch to Ethan's shoulder that spun him half around before he collapsed to his knees. Through the haze of sudden pain, he saw Reynolds tackle Sullivan, the derringer skittering across the floor as the two men grappled briefly before the marshal subdued the judge with practiced efficiency. Then Sophia was beside him, her good arm supporting him as he struggled to remain conscious, her voice both commanding and pleading as she called for a doctor. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan, two sisters, both nurses, both central to the fractured narrative of his existence. "Stay with me," Sophia urged, applying pressure to his wound with a makeshift bandage torn from her own clothing. "We didn't come this far for you to bleed out on a courtroom floor." Ethan managed a pained smile, finding unexpected clarity in the extremity of the moment. "Wouldn't dream of it," he assured her, his voice weaker than intended, but still carrying the determination that had defined both of his identities. Too many questions still unanswered. Around them, order was gradually being restored. The vultures subdued or driven off by Reynolds and the court officers, Sullivan once more restrained and now heavily guarded medical help, arriving for those injured in the brief but violent confrontation. As a physician knelt beside him, Ethan's gaze remained fixed on Sophia's face. The determination in her eyes, the relief as the doctor pronounced his wound serious but not life-threatening, the undisguised emotion that suggested their journey together had become more than a quest for justice. "Diana," he said suddenly, the name emerging from some integrated space between his fractured identities. "Sullivan said I cared for her as I care for you. That wasn't entirely accurate." Sophia's expression softened and understanding dawning. "No, Diana was Logan's love," Ethan explained, wincing as the physician began cleaning his wound. "But you belong to both parts of me, to whoever I am now after everything that's happened." The admission hung between them, neither fully a declaration nor merely an observation, a truth that acknowledged the complex reality of his existence and the equally complex emotions that had developed between them. Before Sophia could respond, Maria Vasquez appeared beside them, her expression transformed by joy, despite the chaos surrounding them. "They found them," she said, tears streaming freely down her weathered cheeks. "The governor's man just received word they found a camp near Nogales, with workers being held against their will. My Alejandro is there alive." The news rippled through the courtroom, whispers becoming exclamations as others who had come seeking information about missing loved ones registered the possibility of reunions they had long since abandoned hope of experiencing. Sullivan, watching from his place between armed guards, seemed to physically diminish as he witnessed the unraveling of his criminal empire, the failure of his final desperate gambit. As Ethan was helped to his feet, arm bandaged and supported in a sling that mirrored Sophia's, he felt a strange sense of completion. Not an ending precisely, but the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The journey that had begun with Sophia's arrival at his ranch had led them here to a moment of justice that, while imperfect, offered the possibility of healing for countless lives touched by Sullivan's corruption. Outside the courthouse, they emerged into the bright Arizona sunlight to find a crowd gathered, citizens of Phoenix and surrounding communities, journalists from territorial newspapers, even a few representatives from Eastern publications drawn by rumors of a conspiracy worthy of national attention. Reynolds joined them as they stood on the courthouse steps, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and weariness. "The governor wants to speak with both of you," he informed them, "about testimony for the federal case they're building and about other matters." "Other matters?" Ethan questioned, though he suspected the nature of those discussions. Reynolds shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its simplicity. "Your identity, for one. Legally, Captain Logan Mercer is still considered missing in action, presumed dead. Ethan Blackwood exists on paper, but is a constructed identity. Sorting that out will require some creativity. The practicalities of reclaiming his true identity, or perhaps forging a new one that honored both parts of his experience, would indeed require attention. But standing in the sunlight with Sophia beside him, with justice being served, and the truth finally emerging from shadow, such concerns seemed manageable, part of a future that now held possibilities beyond vengeance or closure. "There's something else," Sophia said, her expression suddenly intent. "Something I learned during the hearing while you were—" She gestured to his wounded shoulder. "They found Diana." Ethan's heart stuttered, his fractured memories of the woman who had been Logan's fiancée surging forward with renewed clarity. "Alive." Sophia nodded, tears gathering in her eyes but not falling. "Alive. Being held at a private sanitarium outside Prescott under heavy sedation. Sullivan kept her as insurance in case either of our identities ever resurfaced naturally." The news struck Ethan with complex emotion, joy at Diana's survival, uncertainty about what it meant for his already complicated sense of self-concern, for what 5 years of captivity and chemical manipulation might have done to her mind and spirit. "We'll find her," he promised, taking Sophia's hand with his uninjured arm. "Bring her home, help her recover, whatever that takes." Sophia studied his face, searching for something, reassurance, perhaps, or confirmation of the feelings that had developed between them, despite the shadows of the past that lingered around their relationship. "And after," she asked softly, "when Diana is safe, when Sullivan faces justice, when the territorial government is purged of his influence, what then?" It was the question that had haunted them since that night in the mountains. What comes after justice, after vengeance, after the driving purpose that had sustained them through danger and revelation? Ethan considered the courtroom behind them where Sullivan's fate was being determined, the town around them where citizens were beginning to reclaim governance from corruption, the territory beyond where countless lives would be changed by the truth they had helped expose. "I don't know exactly," he admitted, "but I know I don't want to face it alone, locked away in that ranch with ghosts and regrets for company. I want—" He paused, finding words for feelings still taking shape. "I want to build something new, something that honors what was lost without being defined by it." Sophia's smile bloomed slowly like a desert flower after rain. "Something we build together." The question contained an invitation, a possibility that bridged the gap between their shared past of grief and their potential future of healing. Ethan found himself returning her smile, the gesture feeling more natural than it had in 5 years. "I'd like that," he said simply. Reynolds cleared his throat, breaking the moment with the practical concerns that still required attention. "For now, you both need medical care and rest. The governor's offered accommodations at his residence while you recover, safer than a hotel, given that Sullivan still has allies who might seek revenge." The reminder of ongoing danger was sobering, but not surprising. The exposure of such extensive corruption would inevitably leave desperate individuals willing to lash out before their own crimes were revealed. Yet even this concern felt manageable now, a challenge to be faced rather than a shadow to be feared. As they descended the courthouse steps, moving toward the carriage that would transport them to the governor's residence, Ethan found his gaze drawn to the mountains visible on the horizon, the same peaks that had witnessed his journey from isolated grief to renewed purpose, from fractured identity to the possibility of wholeness. 5 years ago, he had buried more than Rebecca beside that oak tree on his ranch. He had interred his sense of purpose, his connection to justice, his very self. Now those qualities had been exhumed painfully but necessarily through Sophia's arrival and all that had followed. The man who had been both Ethan Blackwood and Logan Mercer would never be entirely either again. Instead, he would become someone new, someone shaped by both experiences, both loves, both losses. Someone capable of honoring the past while embracing a future that, for the first time in 5 years, held the promise of genuine healing. As the carriage moved through the streets of Phoenix, Sophia's hand found his once more, a silent affirmation of shared purpose, extending beyond their original quest for justice. Together, they had uncovered truth, exposed corruption, and begun the process of healing wounds, both personal and societal. What came next would be written not in the language of vengeance or grief, but in the more complex, more hopeful vocabulary of reconstruction of lives, rebuilt of justice, served of hearts that, having been broken, might find in their healing a strength greater than before. The Arizona sun bathed the landscape in golden light as they left the courthouse behind, casting long shadows that would eventually fade with the coming of a new day. In that transformative illumination, Ethan Blackwood, or Logan Mercer, or whoever he might become, found something he had thought forever lost in the aftermath of tragedy. He found hope.